Arya von Winterhart walked confidently down the palace stairs, surrounded by soft light and the scent of flowers. She combined nobility and strength, her every movement conveying the dignity of a seasoned warrior. Her gaze remained calm but firm, the gaze of one accustomed to command. Reaching the foot of the stairs, Arya greeted two men in uniform. One of them, smart and serious, saluted, while the other, with a slight smile, offered a few words of greeting. Their gestures conveyed respect and trust in her. She nodded softly, responding with restrained warmth, and cautioned them to be careful on the upcoming mission. Her voice was confident, yet tinged with concern. The warm light surrounding her seemed to highlight the inner harmony of a commander who never lost her human warmth. In a garden filled with the scent of flowers, Arya paused briefly and gazed thoughtfully into the distance. Her eyes shone with a soft light, reflecting an inner peace and a slight melancholy. A gentle breeze stirred the petals, brushing against her hair, and in that moment, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. Under the starry sky, on the castle terrace, two young men in dress uniforms spoke quietly. "Who knows? Such a strong woman," said the red-haired man, looking up at the sky. His companion, a young man with silver-blue hair, listened attentively, sensing the hidden admiration in his friend's words. The silver-haired man smiled slightly, his gaze drifting off into the distance. "She probably trains every day," he said with a slight chuckle. His voice was reserved, but his eyes blazed with respect. A brief silence fell between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. The silence seemed to grow tense. Their gazes met, and each sensed that there was more to the words than simple admiration for the commander. The night around them was clear and serene, the gentle moonlight illuminating their faces, lending a hint of hidden excitement to the conversation. In the evening, candles flickered in the castle hall. A man's hand tightly gripped a wooden goblet, and a dull thud sounded on the table. Arya, sitting opposite him, looked at him with a slight smile. "Are you always so confident?" she asked quietly, a hint of mockery in her voice. He returned her gaze with a playful expression, but beneath his confident mask lurked a hint of apprehension. A spark passed between them, not so much a challenge as an interest, a budding feeling. At that moment, the wind outside died down, and the candle flames swayed gently in unison with their breathing. A pink-haired girl sat in the tavern, clutching a mug and trying to hold back tears. Her shoulders shook with emotion, while the man standing next to her watched with concern. His gaze was warm, and he seemed afraid to break the fragile silence between them. The good-natured innkeeper served them a plate of hot food, trying to cheer them up. The girl sheepishly wiped her cheeks and smiled faintly. Her companion returned the smile, and in that moment, the corners of their destinies seemed to lightly touch. In the far corner of the tavern, a gray-haired man raised his mug and said with sincere gratitude, "Thank you, friend. Thanks to you, we can drink beer in peace." His voice was simple, but his words carried the weight of years lived and the quiet joy of a peaceful evening. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight spilled onto the castle walls, filling the hall with warmth and light. Arya stood by the high window, looking down at the city, shrouded in morning mist. Light footsteps were heard behind her, and a familiar voice said, "Every morning with you feels like a new beginning." Arya was reading a book in the garden, where the air was filled with the scent of roses and fresh air. Julius approached her with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Lady Arya," he said. "Good morning, Julius," she replied softly, closing the book. There was a calm trust in her voice. Mornings in the castle began with the sound of footsteps in the marble corridors and the play of light on the stained glass windows. Arya walked forward confidently, her gaze focused and clear. Two men, meeting her on the way, exchanged friendly words and smiles. She responded with a slight bow, and in this movement, one could sense the dignity of a woman who carries her path with honor. Arya stood by the elegant palace doors, clutching several scrolls tightly in her hands. Her gaze was calm, but within her, a slight tension lingered before an important meeting. Mornings in the castle began with soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, and she moved quietly down the corridor, as if pondering every word. In the nightly orders garden, plum and cherry blossoms bloomed, filling the air with morning freshness. Arya stood amid this splendor, feeling a slight thrill mingled with pride. "This may be the job I've dreamed of," she thought. "But now I realize that dreams require more courage than I thought." She stepped further down the alley and paused as a bright ray of sunlight illuminated her face. The delicate glow was drenched in the pink hues of the flowers, and time seemed to stand still for a moment. Her dress swayed softly in the wind, and her eyes reflected determination and a quiet weariness. A paper airplane suddenly flew down the palace corridor, bobbing slightly in the air before softly hitting Arya on the shoulder. She blinked in surprise and, suppressing a smile, deftly caught it. "Ah!" she blurted out as she unfolded the paper and saw the scribbled lines. In the hall with the tall windows, Julius, sitting relaxed on the sofa, covered his face with his hand and laughed. "Good morning, Your Highness," he said with a touch of irony. Arya blushed slightly, looking down. "Good morning, Julius," she replied quietly, hiding her nervousness behind a businesslike seriousness. The young man with silver-blue hair chuckled wickedly, as if pleased with his own hit. "Ha ha! Right on target!" he exclaimed, looking at the paper in her hands. His laughter filled the room with lightness, causing the maids to smile involuntarily. Arya, still holding the letter, sighed softly and rubbed her forehead, where a slight mark from the blow remained. Despite a hint of irritation, a good-natured smile shone in her eyes. The sun played on her hair, surrounding her figure with a warm rose-gold glow. But not everything that day was so easy. In the background, in one of the offices, someone looked up from their paperwork with displeasure. The dark background, the muted colors, the man's thoughts sounded darker than his words. "I have to deal with this smug upstart." On the wall of the main hall hung a coat of arms, an elegant one, with a sword in the center and golden royal ornaments along the edges. Beneath it glowed the inscription in 2 languages, Sovereign and Heartburn. This symbol reminded everyone who entered that the heart and power always go hand in hand, and their flame fuels destiny. Julius lay on the sofa, pensively writing a letter. His pen glided across the paper, and paper airplanes swirled around him as if carried by the wind. Arya sat at the table next to him, engrossed in her reading, but each fresh gust of paper sent a slight shudder of irritation through her. "When will this ever stop?" she muttered with annoyance, setting aside another sheet of paper. Julius merely responded with a half-smile, not looking up, as if his prank was part of a daily ritual. After a few moments, he put down his pen, glanced at the letters, and quietly said, "I am not here by choice." The soft light from the window gilded his hair, and there was something more to this confession. Weariness, incomprehension, a hidden loneliness. Arya, noticing a coincidence in one of the papers, smiled thoughtfully. "Coincidence? Or just someone's laziness?" she said quietly, leafing through the pages. Her irritation gradually gave way to mild interest and quiet respect for someone else's resourcefulness. The night's gathering was taking place in the Great Hall. Julius entered confidently, his smile cheerful and slightly mischievous. He greeted everyone with the ease of a man who can win over even the strictest officers. When the conversation turned to knights, Julius leaned back in his chair and asked with a hint of mockery, "We are talking about them, aren't we, Your Highness?" Arya's head snapped up, ready to protest, and the tension between them flared like a spark. The red-haired man interjected with a smile. "There's no one among us who could defeat me, unless it's her." He pointed at Arius. A light laugh filled the room, but behind it, there was a respect born, not of fear, but of admiration. Arya sat in a small room, filled with soft light. Papers lay neatly arranged on the table, and with a slight smile but a stern voice, she reminded everyone present of the need to complete their duties on time. Her tone was calm, but there was a steely edge to it, a commanding presence. In the adjoining room, bathed in the golden glow of stained glass windows, Julius leaned back in his chair. His smile was almost cheeky as he answered a casual question. "Is choosing a bride also a duty?" His voice was feigned indifference, but his gaze betrayed a hidden weariness. Arya, standing by the door, glanced at him reservedly. She held the paper airplane that had delivered her a brief message only yesterday. The familiar ink was visible on the white paper. She felt her heart suddenly beat a little faster. Too late to hide her confusion. He watched silently as she unfolded the paper. When the text appeared before her eyes, Julius said quietly, "There's a message." His words held a playful interest, as if he were expecting a certain reaction. Arya frowned, and her fingers trembled as she touched the line where something personal seemed to be written. A little later, a questionnaire appeared in his hands, an old, slightly yellowed one. In a black glove, he carefully held the sheet with a photograph of a girl and the inscription, Bride Candidate Questionnaire. He looked at her with a slight smirk, as if this whole farce bored him rather than interested him. Arya sat in a chair by the fireplace, holding a letter. The flames cast orange reflections on her face, and she watched Julius pensively. He was silent, as if hiding something, and this silence troubled her more than any words. A gust of wind blew the window open, and the letter's pages fluttered and swirled through the air. Julius instantly stood up and deftly snatched up several sheets. "Here, catch them, Commander," he said with a smile, handing her the remaining pages. Arya took them with a soft sigh, trying not to show how trembling her fingers were, but soon a scream pierced the silence. Arya, panicked, rushed to the door, seeing flames engulfing the far side of the hall. She screamed, ordering someone to stop the fire, and her voice carried not despair, but determination, the very determination that makes a true warrior. Later, in the throne room, Julius sat slumped on his throne. His eyes were wet, and his reflection in the mirror opposite him looked at him with sadness. Arya entered quietly and called his name. There was no reproach in her voice, only sympathy. "You're still young, Arya," he said later, looking wearily into the distance. "Don't rush to take on other people's worries." She listened silently, her gaze reflecting a mixture of resentment and understanding. He smiled, tiredly, almost paternally. In another part of the palace, where the vaults were decorated with coats of arms, the old king held a torn photograph of a girl in a lilac dress. "Where is she?" he exclaimed with unexpected excitement. "I want to see my grandchildren." The soft candlelight only emphasized the absurdity of the scene as the servants tried to tidy everything up. Julius stood to the side, listening to the old man's voice grow louder as he demanded a wedding. His inner voice sounded different. Can a heart be forced to love? The thought made him sigh and look away. Arya stood nearby, and only the corners of her lips twitched in understanding. "Old men don't understand," he said, irritably waving away the servants who were trying to hold the fallen child. "They only see the crown." Arya smiled slightly, realizing that even this harshness concealed his weariness and fear of being misunderstood. He stepped closer and unexpectedly wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Commander of the Knights," he whispered with mocking gentleness. "Sometimes even you need to rest." Arya pulled back slightly, embarrassed. Her eyes flashed with protest, but something in her heart trembled. Morning light flooded the room, and Arya stood by the window, gazing thoughtfully into the distance. Her eyes reflected both hope and doubt. "Why is my heart so restless today?" she thought. Julius came closer, quietly taking her hand, and she whispered, albeit awkwardly, "Please don't drag me into your responsibilities." But when their gazes met, neither of them could suppress a slight smile, knowing it was already too late. Julius, flashing a smile, leaned forward slightly and said with a mocking tone, "What, and you don't care at all who I marry?" Arya, frowning, crossed her arms over her chest and replied dryly, though something warm flickered in her eyes. "Just settle down already." Her words came out harsher than she intended, but Julius only laughed and shook his head. Arya's expression softened slightly. She extended her hand and, squeezing his, she said quietly, "Anyone will do, as long as they care about the country." The words sounded like sincere advice, but somewhere deep inside, something personal stirred. He waved her off with a slight smile. "Okay, I get it." His gaze slid over her with that same touch of tenderness she preferred to ignore. Arya, feeling her cheeks flush slightly, said quietly, "You always take everything so easily." He just chuckled, leaning back in his chair. A rumble of footsteps echoed outside the hall. The stone walls echoed, amplified by the spacious vault. Suddenly, two surprised figures emerged from behind a column, a child with a small crown on his head and a tall man in a robe. Arya turned to face them, feeling a strange premonition. Julius, standing against the backdrop of a blooming garden, bowed his head slightly and said casually, "I'm getting married." His voice was unexpectedly calm. The rustle of petals playing in the wind echoed his words. His eyes shone with determination, but deep within them lurked a tremor of memory. For a moment, Arya recalled their past conversations, the smiles, the complex glances, everything that had bound them together more powerfully than duty. A picture flashed before her mind's eye. Evening, the soft glow of lanterns, and his voice confidently pronouncing her name. At this moment, at the other end of the castle, An old king with a white mustache and silver hair exclaimed, beaming with joy. "Really?" He clasped his hands and looked at his courtiers, not hiding his delight. It seemed as if for the first time in a long time, his eyes sparkled with real light. Arya stood by the fountain, gazing at the moon's reflection in the water. She wanted to smile, but a shadow of doubt hovered on her lips. "Who is this little one in a royal robe?" she thought with slight confusion, turning her gaze to the diminutive king standing next to her. They exchanged glances, two worlds, accidentally encountered amid the evening's grandeur. The soft evening light touched the white columns of the palace, turning them into luminous threads between past and present. Everything around them was filled with a sense of calm, as if the night itself had decided to pause. Somewhere nearby, a gloved hand lifted a mug. Steam rose from it, and the warmth of the drink radiated into the palm. The simple movement brought back the feeling of a living presence, as if this small moment were worth an entire day. "What is this?" someone whispered, staring in shock at the document laid out on the golden table. Men in dress uniforms had gathered in the hall, their faces expressing a mixture of surprise and delight.
Approved!
One of the officers shouted, clenching his fists. His voice echoed through the hall. The others followed suit, raising their hands in solemn unanimity. Joy filled the air, a rare, genuine outburst. A clear sky shone in the square before the palace. Arya and Julius stood side by side, silent, looking up. The wind played with her hair, and he stood a little closer than etiquette permitted. Their silence spoke louder than any speech. The world around her grew softer. Light clouds, stars, golden light on her skin. Everything merged into one calm breath. Arya lowered her gaze, allowing herself a barely perceptible smile. The next morning, she stood in a narrow city alley, squinting against the sun's rays. Her shoulders relaxed, and a calm smile played on her lips. "How pleasant it is to feel the morning sun on my skin," she whispered, for the first time in a long time thinking of neither titles nor duties, but simply of herself. Arya was walking down the street when she noticed a slight stir in the crowd. People were chatting, pointing ahead. Some were smiling, some exclaiming in amazement. She involuntarily stopped and asked, a little surprised, "What's going on?" The rays of dawn slowly touched the stone walls, awakening the city with a soft glow. Arya glanced around and turned with a slight smile to the passers-by. Their faces reflected surprise. It wasn't every day that the Knights Commander addressed them with such warmth. "Today is the day everything can change," she thought, watching the light color the streets pink. A little further away, beyond the bustle of humanity, against the backdrop of a starry sky, stood a girl with pink hair and cat ears. She gazed thoughtfully upward, where the planets glided slowly. Her eyes reflected the universe, mysterious, cold, alluring. A feeling akin to a longing for the unattainable grew in her heart. Arya's heartbeat involuntarily quickened as she entered the grand hall. At the far end, she saw Julius standing in the sunlight. He looked slightly nervous, and upon noticing her, he quickly straightened. "You look worried," she said softly. "I'm just glad to see you here," he replied with a slight smile that made her lips twitch. Later, in the morning silence, she said the usual, "Good morning," and the words echoed throughout the spacious hall. But her greeting seemed strangely solemn against the backdrop of the Red Demon's silhouette, fleetingly reflected in the stained glass windows. Julius, turning, was momentarily speechless. In the distance, two men in formal uniform stopped, staring intently at the retreating figure of a cloaked girl. Her steps were quick and determined, but there was a hint of pain in them. A dark cloud slowly formed over the palace, and the air grew heavier, as if something great was about to happen. Before her next meeting, Arya stood by the door, holding her breath and closing her eyes. Voices echoed in her head, memories, snatches of conversations, doubts. She steeled herself, becoming the cool person they always expected of her. Meanwhile, music began playing in the hall, and a group of young people in dress uniform joyfully celebrated, blowing horns and exchanging cheerful shouts of congratulations. Their faces beamed with pride and relief, as if a cord of tension had snapped within each of them. Arya stepped outside, where the air was filled with the scent of spring flowers. Petals swirled around her, gently brushing her shoulders and hair. "How strange! It's like another world," she thought, feeling a slight thrill mingled with gratitude for the moment of peace. That evening, in the banquet hall, the young men raised their hands again, celebrating the event that was now the talk of the palace. "Today is the day everything changes," one of them said. The words echoed off the walls, as if fate itself had nodded its approval. Arya looked around in surprise. In an instant, the air filled with light, and flowers appeared out of nowhere. They slowly fell from the ceiling, settling on the floor like a blessing from above. "What is this?" she whispered, barely believing her eyes. Next to her, a red-haired man in uniform stood in the doorway, unable to hold back his tears. His voice trembled. "I'm so touched." He said the name with such pain, as if even breathing was a challenge. Arya clasped her hands, unsure how to comfort him. Julius came up behind the man and quietly hugged him. "It's okay," he said softly. The redhead, still crying, nodded, repeating, "He's alive! Alive!" His tears were more like release. Arya stood nearby, amazed by the sincerity of this human joy. But soon, a slight anxiety rose in her chest again. She pressed her hand to her heart, forcing herself to breathe more evenly. "It's just the prince's bad joke," Arya mentally reassured herself. But the warmth from Julius's recent touch refused to leave her skin. She had her back turned when she heard his voice. Julius was recounting the events that had engulfed the entire castle, the storm of discussion, the tearful red-haired man who had become the hero of the hour. Arya listened silently, without turning around, feeling every word weigh on her heart. As he approached, she turned and met his gaze. He stood too close, playful, confident, dangerously familiar. She cursed silently. Damn prince. But a faint smile appeared on her lips. In the far corner of the room, a red-haired man held the hand of a pink-haired girl. He was excited, scared, and happy all at once. There were tears in his eyes, and a confused smile on his face. She, embarrassed, didn't know what to say, but she didn't pull away. Arya saw their hands tremble slightly, and suddenly felt as if time had stood still around them. Her heart sank with something tender and sad. "Where exactly do you want to meet?" she asked quietly, not looking away. At that moment, 3 young knights entered the hall. Their faces were tense, their eyes filled with anxiety, not joy, but foreboding. They were silent, looking at Arius and Julius, as if awaiting an order they dreaded to hear. And then a scream rang out in the silence. The young man with the sword on his back, who had been smiling a moment ago, suddenly fell to his knees. "Whatever happens, I wish you happiness," he cried out, clutching his chest, and fell to the floor, screaming in pain. Arya screamed first, rushing toward him. Julius grabbed her shoulder, but she pulled away, hearing nothing but her own heart, bursting with fear. The sound of footsteps and hurried voices echoed through the palace vaults. Young men in dress uniforms scurried about, trying to help their wounded comrade. Someone handed him a flask, someone else tried to hold his head, but blood continued to drip onto the tiled floor. Arya stood by the wall, watching with alarm, her fists clenched helplessly. "Commander!" one of the officers cried out, kneeling beside the prostrate man. He shook him by the shoulders, his voice trembling with panic. "Please, wake up!" The desperation in his gaze forced Arya to look away. Her inner voice urged her to intervene, but her feet were rooted to the spot. When things had calmed down a bit, Arya turned to Julius. His face remained tense, and she said quietly, "The prince is the only one who can be with me." Her voice was calm, but there was a depth to it that could hurt. Julius listened without blinking, and then one corner of his mouth twitched slightly. She stood before him in the dim light, her eyes shining. The air seemed to tremble with an inner light. "Sometimes, to understand true strength, you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable," she said. The words echoed off the walls, as if they carried a secret meaning known only to the two of them. On the wall behind her hung a coat of arms, a sword in the center and graceful script. Beneath it, a name in white Latin, Sovereign and Heartburn. A symbol of power and loyalty, a subtle reminder of the price of duty. Arya walked through the palace garden. The morning silence was almost ringing, but her own footsteps resounded clearly and solemnly. "Who said everything will be all right?" she thought. The light played on the columns, and a feeling of excitement, like a premonition of change, grew in her chest. When she reached the end of the alley, her thoughts returned to him again, reckless and stubborn. "I can't be a good match for a demon like you," Arya whispered irritably, almost not noticing that she was smiling. A familiar voice came from behind her. Hello, he almost whispered, but her shoulders immediately tensed. Julius placed his hand on her shoulder and leaned closer. Arya flinched, but didn't turn away, feeling the blood rush to her cheeks. He hugged her from behind, lightly and kindly, as if there were no walls between them. "What's bothering you so?" he asked. Her answer was just a quiet exhalation. "Everything," she said, and then added again, "and nothing." Julius smiled, trying to bring back at least a shadow of the former warmth to her lips. "Did something good happen?" she asked a little later, calmer. His smile became softer, almost childish, and in her thoughts the words echoed. Again, again, and again. The feeling returned every time he looked at her like that, but suddenly the edge of patience broke. She grabbed him sharply by the collar and pinned him against the wall. "Enough!" Arya screamed so loudly that the sound echoed off the stone slabs. Julius, looking at her in shock, didn't understand what had caused her outburst. His eyes widened and his voice broke. A young man with silver blue hair stood on the balcony above them. His eyes sparkled in the evening light, filled with such genuine admiration, as if he were understanding for the first time what a person is capable of when he protects what is dear to him. Julius suddenly laughed. "Is that your reflection, Arya? Or am I blind?" he joked, looking at her figure shrouded in a dark glow. A demonic silhouette flashed behind her. She frowned, looking at him as if she didn't know who stood before her. Then, Julius abruptly pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. There was no joke in his gesture, only a demand. "Look at this," he said, with a firmness rarely expected of him. His seriousness confused her. Arya took the scroll, clutching it too tightly. "What are you doing?" she said through clenched teeth. Julius answered calmly, with a slight smile, but his eyes hid sadness. "Only what I must." She realized that this was not a prince, but a man. He met her gaze and asked quietly, "What are you talking about?" Silence fell between them for a moment. The evening lights of the city outside the window flickered on one after another, a reminder that time waits for no one. "It wasn't a joke, Arya," he said seriously when she finally lowered her eyes. "Not a joke," he repeated more softly. His voice carried the weariness of a man struggling not with enemies, but with his own heart. She pointed at the document's seal. "This sign, it means the decision is final," Arya said, almost in a whisper, trying to process what she'd just said. Her lips trembled, but the smile remained. He handed her the document, bowing his head slightly. "Even for me, this was a difficult task," Julius said with a sad smile. His easygoing manner had vanished, giving way to the sincerity she had long craved from him. Arya stared at the letter, unable to believe it. "But yesterday you talked about marriage!" she exclaimed. Julius tried to take the letter, but she held it tightly. Their hands touched, and for a moment, the air between them seemed alive. Like before the storm, when everything is just beginning. Arya stood in the middle of the hall, where the warm candlelight flickered on the marble walls. In her hands, she held a document with a coat of arms, and each line seemed to pulse with its own pain. The thought flashed through her mind. This order destroys everything. The next moment, a black-gloved hand, without hesitation, tore the sheet in half, and the fragile sound of the paper hung in the air like an echo of the decision. They stood too close. There was barely any air between them. The flowers around them filled the space with the scent of spring. "So, you really said that?" Julius asked with a slight smile, as if testing her. Arya stepped back slightly and calmly replied, "Exactly." His fingers touched her cheek with a caress that felt both tender and challenging at the same time. She sighed, trying not to give in to the feeling of closeness. "Please, stop! Are you serious?" Arya said, hiding her smile. Julius bowed his head, his voice soft. "How could anyone resist you?" His tone was playful, but his eyes held a surprising sincerity. He closed his eyes and nodded softly, as if confirming something without words. His face reflected the calm of a confident man, but within that confidence dwelt courage, the risk of feeling. Arya looked at him, unable to discern where the game ended and the truth began. Later, she stood across from him, her voice shaking as she admitted, "It's my fault. I failed." Julius laughed, holding back tears. His laughter wasn't mocking. It was warm, liberating. "And that's your strength, Arya," he replied. Her laugh sounded awkward, trembling on the edge between embarrassment and relief. This brief moment was a reminder that everything was worth it, even if every word was hard to say. A metallic glint was reflected somewhere in the corridor. The man gripped the hilt of his red-wrapped sword, feeling the cold steel respond to his touch. In his hands, the weapon seemed alive, reflecting the reflections of the stained glass windows. Red, gold, pale blue. "Wait," Arya said firmly, as Julius took a step toward the door. Her fingers closed around his hand. He turned with his usual half-smile. "I'm not leaving until we're done," he declared. Tension hung between them, like before a thunderstorm. He slowly raised his head and lifted his glove slightly. "Perhaps we should play a game," he asked with audacious ease. There was a challenge in his voice. Arya didn't answer, only narrowed her eyes as if agreeing to an invisible duel. Night fell upon the palace. In the soft torchlight, Arya whispered, "What?" Her thoughts were jumbled. Her words seemed foreign. Julius came closer, his gaze calm, almost serious. He stood there, and that was enough to make everything lose its meaning again. "My father is delighted," he said, with that same expression where joy and irritation were intertwined. "He believes this decision will save the crown." Arya remained silent and, without taking her eyes off the window, said, "There is no way out." Those 3 words were like an oath. He chuckled, but quickly grew serious. "Then defeat me, at least once. If you can, I'll undo everything." She glanced up, seeing how easily he'd uttered the impossible. Later, by the fountain, his voice softened. "Well, what do you say?" he asked, extending his hand. Her face seemed calm in the reflection of the moonlit water, but her fingers trembled slightly before they touched his palm. On the wall behind them, a crest shimmered, a golden sword and the inscription, "Sovereign and Heartburn." This symbol forever linked their destinies. Arya touched the embossed line, realizing that each letter was the seal of their choice. She looked at him and said quietly, "Even if you say so, it won't change anything." Julius nodded, a tired kindness in his eyes. "I know, but I'll still stay here." His honesty sounded like a promise. Somewhere far away in the night forest, a mysterious fire flickered. A voice echoed, whispering, "His Highness is a perfect creation of light." Arya felt a cold shiver, and for the first time, clearly realized how truly different he was. Not just a man. The palace courtyard glowed. The king and his advisors gazed in admiration at Julius, surrounded by the glow of the holy sword. In that moment, he once again became the child chosen by fate, pure and unwavering. Music rang out somewhere in the distance. A young man with silver blue hair played the violin. A girl with platinum pink eyes listened to the sounds, feeling an anxiety that was almost like hope. Everything merged, the music, the light, the breath. Arya smiled, looking at Julius. "Well," she said, "you may be a swordsman, but it seems your sword is sharp not only in battle." Their gazes met, and time seemed to stand still. He laughed, and the flowers around him barely moved in the wind, as if fate itself quietly approved of this moment. Arya stood with her back to Julius, her voice unexpectedly soft against the light-filled park. "I always thought our paths would diverge, but now I realize this is only the beginning." Julius approached and said quietly, "Then let me walk beside you, no matter what." Their voices faded into the silence of the fading day. She smiled and suggested they move to another place. The breath of the night was growing deeper. "Let's get out of here," Arya suggested. "It's too noisy here." Julius rolled his eyes in mild irritation, but obediently followed, unable to find the words to object. 2 young men in dress uniforms sat on the floor against the wall. They laughed, sharing memories of bygone days and their friendship. The world around them momentarily ceased to exist, giving way to the simple happiness of being here and now. The clash of blades echoed across the courtyard. Arya lunged forward with her sword. Julius deftly parried her thrust, their gazes locked in tension. Off to the side, 2 young knights watched the duel with restrained delight, realizing that it wasn't just steel that sparked between these two. Arya, clutching her sword, firmly warned her interlocutor, "Remember, I will not forgive betrayal, even if it costs me dearly." After a short pause, her eyes flashed with determination, and the hall was bathed in the sunset light. A lively cry echoed through the hallway, 2 young knights congratulating each other on their long-awaited day off. Their brief joy even made Arya smile, remembering the simple pleasures she'd lost over her years of service. Rushing forward, Arya realized that running away would be like betraying herself. It might not be a fight to the death, but the shame of defeat could be worse than any wound. Julius, taking up his sword again, struck with a playful smile. Arya easily dodged it, her face focused, her voice firm. "You're still as fast as ever." At one point, their swords crossed. Their eyes met. The brief encounter held far more passion than resentment. "You were always stronger than I thought," he said, not breaking eye contact. "And you were always too stubborn," she replied again. And suddenly, everything changed. The floor beneath her feet cracked as Julius attacked, and Arya fell with a scream, surrounded by a cloud of dust and debris. Panicked, the two men shouted warnings, trying to avoid the new danger. The wind carrying their voices seemed filled with anxiety. Everything was becoming increasingly unclear. Arya suddenly found herself in his arms. Their gazes met in a warm but tense silence. A feeling of intimacy, but also a new fear, arose between them. She hugged Julius tighter, magic swirling around them, pulling the vortex of fate close. "Don't be afraid! I will protect you," she whispered confidently. He was surprised by the power of her words and trusted her hands. Together, they watched the explosion destroy the world around them, a world full of fire and change. Julius's insides raged. Why was his heart beating so fast when she was near? He carefully studied her face, catching the subtle excitement and that strange tenderness that was always hidden deep under the mask of severity. Suddenly, Julius gently embraced her with a playful smile, and Arya was flustered, clutching her sword but not letting go. "You're stronger than you think," he whispered. She was surprised at how fragile the words of encouragement felt at that moment. Arya suddenly lowered her head, admitting defeat, her voice trembling as delicate flowers bloomed around her. In that moment, for the first time, she allowed herself to be weak. Julius leaned closer, his smile promising something warm and sincere. The sunset had long since faded from the sky, coloring their every gesture with warm shades of happiness and sadness. The king's angry voice rang out from above, shouting at Arya. She stood by the window, looking into the distance, but no longer feeling any fear. Everything that was happening was merely a reflection of someone else's choice. And at sunset, in the golden light, Julius playfully hugged Arya from behind, causing her a slight irritation and unconscious embarrassment. "You're too serious," he said, smiling. "Let me dispel that sternness." He held no power in his hands, only a desire to be there and protect. Arya was breathing heavily, leaning on her knees. Julius, watching her under the palace arch at dawn, smiled softly. Arya's inner voice quietly echoed in her thoughts. "I should have been faster, but why is my heart beating so hard?" Arya took a deep breath, realizing she'd have to write a statement. I'll have to write a statement," flashed through her mind. She looked down, feeling a little awkward, but a spark of determination was already igniting in her eyes. Julius, with a playful smile, declared that this time they were definitely accomplices. His confidence slightly irritated Arya, but he merely raised a sly eyebrow, enjoying her reaction. He smiled with a bright light behind him, as if he were the embodiment of morning itself, while Arya screamed in fury that it was impossible. Absolutely impossible. His gaze remained calm, as if her prohibition were merely an invitation to play. The girl lowered her head, hiding her despair, and for a moment there was silence. Julius calmly apologized for intruding on her sadness, his voice sincere and gentle. He demanded a passionate kiss, looking her straight in the eyes, and Arya froze, shocked and outraged by his words. A blush appeared on her cheeks, and she didn't know what to say. With a hint of mockery, Julius reminded her of the penalty for losing, and Arya flushed, exclaiming that no one had mentioned such a condition. He laughed quietly, as if he'd expected just such a reaction. He leaned a little closer, smiling. "So you never asked?" Arya retorted sharply, not hiding her irritation. "What nonsense!" Their voices died down, and in the ensuing silence, only their gazes, full of contradictions, remained. Julius feigned doubt as he asked if the renowned swordswoman could disclaim responsibility for her words. Arya was taken aback, panic flickering in her eyes, as if every word he uttered revealed something hidden. A girl with platinum pink hair stood in uniform, stunned and tense, against the backdrop of a dark purple patterned sky. Her heart was beating louder than usual, as if presaging something momentous and irreversible. The silver blue-haired boy smiled, tilting his head with a hint of mockery. "What? And what do you say to that?" he asked, his voice laced with a playful confidence that made Arya's breath catch. Arya gathered her strength and declared her intentions with determination. Julius listened attentively, then smiled softly, as if approving of her choice, and in that moment, a fragile but sincere understanding blossomed between them. Julius looked at Arya with a slight smile, their gaze meeting in the soft morning light. "Do you always smile like this when you think of me?" she asked quietly. He leaned closer, his eyes warm. "Only when you're around." Arya's heart skipped a beat. She pressed herself against him, feeling their hands intertwined in a gentle touch. A voice inside her whispered, "In this moment, the world narrows to his touch." And he murmured, barely audible, "You were always closer than I thought." Their steps paused. Their feet were almost touching, their breaths mingling. The atmosphere between them was tense as a string, and in every pause there was a sense of anticipation that neither dared to disturb. They stood beneath the blossoming branches, the air between them filled with tenderness. Arya gazed out at the sunset from the window, lost in thought, while Julius remained silent, watching her with an expression mingling respect and hidden excitement. Arya looked up and kissed him softly. The bright colors around them seemed to spill with warmth, and their feelings filled the space. A simple, pure moment in which there was neither past nor future. Their lips touched again, quietly, tenderly, with trust. The garden was filled with the calm of evening. The moon's reflection trembled in the fountain's water. The wind caressed their hair, as if blessing the silence. Arya looked away thoughtfully, trying to hide her embarrassment. "Why does my heart beat so strangely when he's around?" she thought. The wind rustled the leaves, and suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. It was Julius. He approached, stopping right next to her. Arya looked up in surprise. "Why are you so close?" she asked, feeling her heart quicken. He smiled slightly mockingly. "I just wanted to see you up close." She blushed but didn't look away, and the air between them seemed to ignite with unspoken words. A young man with silver blue hair and bright eyes stood by the window, a soft smile playing on his face. The rays of dawn glided across his uniform, lending warmth to his gaze. "You know," he said, almost in a whisper, "sometimes it seems like even the light gets jealous when you're around." Arya slapped Julius across the cheek in anger. He froze, shocked by her outburst. How could he speak so carelessly about my feelings? She thought. "You have no idea what all this means to me," she screamed, her voice filled with pain and sincerity. Julius suddenly cried out, catching his hand on the edge of the table. "Ow!" he blurted out, a mixture of surprise and slight pain. He looked at Arya in confusion, then smiled awkwardly, as if he couldn't believe he'd said it out loud. Arya stood among the fragrant flowers, covering her mouth with her hand, as if afraid her breath would betray her embarrassment. Her eyes shone with a confused light, and the delicate scent of spring hung around her. Her cheeks flushed as she realized how close he stood. Julius looked at her with a hint of alarm and said quietly, "If you keep teasing me like this, it might get too much." His voice trembled, half joke, half warning. Arya smiled, not hiding her excitement. "Do you really like me?" she asked, barely audible. Her voice mingled tenderness and timid anticipation, and her eyes blazed with something weightless yet inevitable. He moved closer and gently pulled her into his arms. Their gazes met, reflecting warmth, trust, and an undeniable attraction. "You are my constant star in this world," he whispered. Arya shuddered, feeling the words resonate in her heart. Julius leaned closer, whispering in her ear, his breath brushing her skin. The evening air was filled with the scent of leaves and anticipation. "You knew I couldn't look at anyone else," he said quietly. Against the blurred backdrop of flowers, his insistent words rang out. "Did you just realize it now?" Arya stood up straight, her voice soft but confident. "Now I understand that this feeling isn't just an act." He smiled slightly, as if his thoughts had been confirmed. A long-awaited and sincere question hung beneath the starry sky. Its voice was almost inaudible, dissolving among the stars. "Is it possible to love more deeply than I do now?" The answer was silence, filled with an invisible agreement. At dawn, Arya peered around the corner, looking up at the brightening sky. Every new day is like a new attempt to understand what fate has in store, she thought, feeling the fresh air fill her chest with hope. Her eyes widened with sudden insight. Through the soft morning light, she seemed to see the answer to her question. "So that's why my heart won't calm down," she realized, holding her breath. Near the old tower, a girl with long pink hair held a bucket thoughtfully. Am I noticing what's truly important? She wondered, watching the sun glint on the water, reflecting the thin line of her smile. The girl with platinum pink hair yawned softly, covering her mouth with her hand. The early morning warmth softly enveloped the room. He appeared in the doorway, watching her with a slight smile. A simple, homely tenderness flickered in their gazes. Arya looked down at the water he held in his hands. Why does my heart beat so fast when he's near? She asked herself. He smiled faintly. Do you feel it? Even the water preserves our silence. A demon with a flaming crown stood before her in the glow of crimson flames. His sinister laughter echoed throughout the hall. Arya, frightened but composed, looked up. Her eyes reflected fear mingled with desperate determination. Arya kissed Julius tenderly. The warmth of their touch seemed to illuminate everything around them. In every look you give me, I find my home, she whispered. He responded with a sincere, quiet light that could not be faked. The girl looked at her hands, her heart beating faster than usual. Why am I shaking? She whispered. The warmth of his memory filled her chest, and she realized she was no longer afraid of this shaking. Arya suddenly splashed water on herself, causing Julius to yelp in surprise. What are you doing? He exclaimed, but his voice was tinged with anxious concern. I need to be more decisive today, she replied with a stubborn smile. At dawn, Arya stood in the garden, touching the strands of her hair as it shimmered in the sunlight. Her gaze held doubt, a hint of sadness, and budding confidence. Maybe answers don't come when you search for them, but when you simply allow yourself to feel, she thought. The elegant crest with its sword at its center shimmered in the evening lights of the ball. The name, Sovereign and Heartburn, shimmered in shades of blue and pink. Under the castle's vaults, Arya stood by the window watching the sunset as Julius approached quietly. His footsteps were soft, like music, and the sun glided across his uniform. A boy with silver blue hair strode confidently across the square, bathed in golden light. The wind swayed the flowers blooming beneath his feet. Today will be different, he thought, feeling a strange lightness, as if his heart were guiding him forward. In the morning light, he stretched slowly and yawned lazily, covering his mouth with his hand. A new day, Julius whispered, allowing himself a brief smile. At that moment, the door swung open and Arya entered the room, looking away slightly sheepishly. He watched in surprise as someone in a dress uniform rushed past. Who is that? Flashed through his mind. At that moment, Arya, out of breath, stopped in front of him. Sorry it was so sudden, she said, trying to catch her breath. In the throne room, a young man calmly looked at the desperate king, whose voice trembled. Help me, you foolish son, he cried out in panic. Julius raised an eyebrow. What have you done now? He replied with surprise, not hiding his tired irony. The sound of the blow echoed through the hall. The air trembled, as if awakening forgotten feelings in their hearts. Arya clenched her fists tightly, and Julius looked at her with concern. A question was evident in his eyes. Not fear, but concern. Arya descended swiftly, the wind playing in her hair. I can't wait any longer, she thought, her heart pounding. Julius stood below, motionless, his hand calmly on the hilt of his sword, as if he knew she would come. She ran, shouting for him to step aside. Your Highness, step aside! But Julius only smiled, not looking away. No need to waste energy on warnings, he replied softly, and this certainty only further confused Arya. Suddenly, she grabbed his hand. Her fingers trembled, but her grip was firm. Julius froze, struck by her boldness, and for the first time allowed himself to feel tenderness in a movement where before he had seen only stubbornness. She stumbled, and he caught her at the last moment. Oh, wow, he said with a slight smile. Arya blushed, but laughed, looking straight into his eyes. Are you always this careless? He asked. Only when you're around, she replied, still laughing. He held her in his arms, and the world grew strangely quiet. His breathing became even, his gaze thoughtful and soft. Everything around me seems to freeze when she's near, Julius thought, feeling he didn't want to let go. He smiled and whispered, It seems my bride has chosen to fall into my arms. Arya flushed with anger and snapped back. Let go immediately! But there was no longer any strength in her voice, only a subtle hint of embarrassment. Her words burned the air, and Julius looked down. She reproached him, and he remained silent, embarrassedly denying, at a loss for words. Their misunderstanding dissolved in silence, giving way to a growing feeling they were afraid to acknowledge. He laughed at her anger and remarked, "You're not blushing at all, even though I'm holding you." Arya frowned and snapped, "Now's not the time for that!" But she didn't look away, and their laughter brought them closer together than any words could. The castle suddenly erupted in commotion. Servants ran through the halls in panic. The tiger, a gift from a neighboring state, had escaped, carrying the king in its jaws. Julius, observing the chaos, chuckled. "This certainly promises to be an eventful day," he said quietly. Arya clenched her fists as she stood opposite her. Julius glanced at her and said thoughtfully, "So that's what it is." She looked determined, and his smile warmed, as if he was proud of this challenge. The spring sun softly illuminated the garden. Arya shuddered as Julius touched her shoulder. Their gazes met and lingered, a flicker of trust, and something more than just words. He suggested with a playful glint in his eye, "What if we have a competition?" Arya raised an eyebrow and, hiding a smile, replied, "Only if you don't make excuses afterward." Her confidence made him laugh. A white tiger, bathed in light, raced across the courtyard, leaving a shimmering trail behind it. Arya stood on the balcony, watching the spectacle. "It seems like everyone is holding their breath," she thought, feeling the wind ruffling her hair. In the great hall, a young man in royal robes sat, cuddle-hugging a white tiger with blue eyes. He whispered softly, "You were always there, even when the world was crumbling." His voice was filled with calm, and the dawn illuminated them both with a soft glow. The words, "Whoever catches the tiger first wins," shimmered against a dark purple background. The evening garden was bathed in lantern light. Arya and Julius stood facing each other, the wind gently rustling their clothes. The air was thick with the tension of play and mystery, mingled with a touch of tenderness. Arya, consumed by rage, approached the tiger. Her steps were determined, and Julius merely followed her calmly, watching the beast's reaction. The tiger, its head bowed, seemed to understand that before it was not just a girl, but someone whose spirit was as strong as that of a predator. The white tiger roared, stirring the air around him. Snow fell slowly, reflecting the moonlight. Two people, Arya and Julius, stood in the freezing wind. Their breath steamed, and the only sound in the silence of the winter forest was the roar of their animal voices. Arya opened her eyes abruptly and shuddered, as if awakening from a dream. Her heart was pounding wildly, and the words escaped her. "Your Highness!" She didn't immediately realize where she was. Dream and reality were so closely intertwined. The next second, the tiger knocked her off her feet. Arya fell with a scream, and the ground seemed to give way beneath her. Leaves fell, and the wind played in her hair. Her gaze was filled with fear and confusion, but courage still glimmered within her. She collapsed right into Julius's arms. They both landed on the ground, laughing through the surprise. "Every moment with him is like falling without fear," flashed through her mind, as his arms held her firmly but gently. Julius leaped forward, determination blazing in his eyes. Evening was falling over the city, and the air was thick with the anticipation of change. He paused by the window, looking out at the lights, and whispered softly, "I must protect what's dear." He walked along the terrace past a white tiger, his hand on the hilt of his sword. His footsteps echoed in the morning air. The tiger looked after him, and a strange glimmer flickered in its eyes, as if they held a memory. The tiger's gaze was piercing, its blue eyes shining against the soft dawn light. Arya stood at the edge of the forest, peering into the distance. "What are you hiding, White Guardian?" she thought, feeling an unconscious anxiety fill her chest. Julius stood on the balcony, gazing at the mountain peaks. The morning light fell on his shoulders, highlighting his calm and hidden strength. His eyes reflected the horizon, the place where a new destiny was born. A roar echoed from the depths of the forest again. A white tiger emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing turquoise. The wind carried the scent of snow. This sound, this powerful roar, seemed to be a call to something ancient, forgotten, but not lost. There was a sharp thud. Julius's foot landed hard on the stone slabs, and the air seemed to tremble. A thud of footsteps echoed through the palace corridors, a challenge to fate that could not be revoked. The white tiger, baring his fangs, growled so loudly that the ground vibrated beneath his feet. Sweat glistened on his muzzle, but his gaze remained bright, burning with determination. It seemed as if he and the man across from him were equal contenders in this strange dance of power. The sky erupted in flames. Julius stepped forward, looking straight into the eyes of the dragon, with the tiger sitting below him. "I won't back down," he thought. His reflection in the fire was as determined as steel. The city at Slim was ablaze with lights. A young man stepped out of the shadows, extending his hand. "Everything has changed, but I'm still here," he thought. His gaze was directed forward, toward the glimmer of hope. The light shifted from black to white, filling the space. Arya stood by the window, the soft light falling on her face. She thought about how the world around her had changed. There was something beautiful and terrifying in this change. At dawn, a hand gently slid over the white tiger's head. His eyes narrowed, as if responding with gratitude. No hostility, only quiet acceptance. A world where man and beast found common ground without words. Her palm rested on the tiger's snow-white fur. The wind swirled the leaves around them. "Can you feel it?" Arya whispered. The tiger closed his eyes and bowed his head, as if agreeing that the heart didn't need words to understand. Julius, stroking the tiger's neck, quietly said, "I don't hate you. You are a noble creature." His voice was calm and filled with a kindness he rarely allowed himself. The tiger's eyes reflected a calm understanding. In the palace hall, Arya saw the king kneeling before two courtiers. She froze in surprise. Why did he fall so suddenly? She thought. A strange premonition stirred in her soul, as if this was the denouement of the story they were still writing. A young man with silver blue hair slowly ran his hand over the white tiger's fur. His gaze was thoughtful, almost sad. He quietly said that the tiger's fangs had worn down, and that he himself had once been sent to foreign lands. Arya listened, her gaze fixed on him, feeling these words resonate in her heart. Julius sat down next to Arya, who sat among the scattered letters, and gently touched her head. Candlelight filled the room, warm and calm, like the breath of the past. "You always try to be strong, but even the strong need to rest," he whispered. Arya stood with her back to him, watching Julius gently pet the tiger. The wind gently ruffled her hair. What is he trying to say? She thought, watching his gentle movements, which held more pain than peace. He suddenly approached and gently touched her head. Arya froze, surprised by the gesture. Confusion, mixed with warmth, flared in her chest, a feeling she wasn't prepared for. She turned sharply, her eyes blazing with anger. "What are you doing, Julius?" Her voice wavered. He pulled away, momentarily confused, but then smiled softly. He sighed, looking down, and said he just wanted to show her what it was like to be there. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. Arya looked at him with disbelief, and her anger began to give way to confusion. The morning greeted her with the scent of flowers. She stood among the petals and quietly said, "I simply didn't expect to serve such a man." Her words rang not with resentment, but with unsurprised admiration. Arya threw her coat over her shoulder and said, "I'm taking the day off today." Her voice was light, slightly mocking. Julius stood behind her, watching her leave, smiling almost invisibly. In the vast, light-filled hall, he extended his hand to her. "Let me show you how beautiful the world is when you look with your heart," Julius said. Arya looked at him and couldn't help but smile. He came up behind her and hugged her. "Just a minute," he said, pressing his cheek to her shoulder. Flower beds bloomed all around, and the morning air was filled with a soft silence. Julius's warm arms settled on her shoulders again. He hugged Arya, a mischievous smile playing on his face. She turned, her eyes shining with surprise and quiet agreement. He pulled a red ribbon ornament from his pocket and held it between them. "This is for you, so you'll always remember me." Arya looked away, feeling something tender and treacherously alive tremble within her. The corridor was bathed in sunlight. Arya walked confidently, each step echoing softly. Her thoughts were collected, but her heart was beating treacherously faster than usual. In the empty hall, she sighed heavily. Why is everything so complicated? Arya thought. A chasm of doubt lay between her and her reflection in the mirror, but her eyes still held a light. Julius approached her, holding a bow-tied string. "I want you to always be near, Arya," he said quietly. Arya's heart pounded, and she couldn't hide her smile. Their gazes met. The air between them seemed to tremble, and the silence became louder than any words. One step, and the line between friendship and something more almost disappeared. Suddenly, Julius grabbed Arya's face, as if afraid of losing control. She flinched in surprise. His eyes sparkled with contradictions, determination, fear, and tenderness. She angrily pushed him away, crossing her arms and exasperatedly saying, "You're just so unbearable sometimes." Julius blushed, scratched his head, and chuckled sheepishly. "I guess so, but only around you," he added. He picked up the decoration and promised with a slight smile, "You'll find out your punishment this evening." His eyes sparkled, as if the evening really had much to decide. Arya stopped abruptly and clutched the ribbon in her fist. Her gaze became determined, but there was a quiet unease hidden within it. Anticipation hung in the air, as if the evening were drawing nearer to something inevitable. She stood by the door of her room, wondering what the evening would bring. "What awaits me today?" she thought, looking at the flickering light inside. Every breath became a step toward destiny. Her gaze froze, as if she'd heard something important. Surprise appeared on her face, then calm. A sense of certainty stirred within her, as if everything that was happening made sense. In the hallway, two maids laughed as they carried a basket of laundry. Arya watched them, a slight smile crossing her face. At that moment, everyday life seemed surprisingly warm and vibrant. In the library, a maid carried a stack of books. A glimpse of Arya's face flashed behind a box. "In this quiet corner, I find peace," she thought. The words, like lines from a book, echoed softly in the silence. She entered the room, where she was greeted by two maids with joyful expressions. Arya smiled at them, feeling for the first time part of something real and peaceful. She stopped at the door and said softly, "Arya von Winterhart's room." The short phrase sounded like a promise and gave a feeling of home. A maid, running past with a box, brushed her elbow. Arya shuddered and instinctively touched the brooch around her neck. The warm metal seemed to remind her of something important. She watched the servants rushing around the palace, feeling tired and slightly agitated. Something was approaching, quietly, like breathing behind the door. By the window, the room was bathed in soft morning light. Arya stood motionless, gazing at the rays filtering through the curtains. In this light, she found the peace she had long sought. Dressed in her dress uniform, she turned sharply, alarm flashing in her eyes. Her heart skipped a beat, as if the world had finally taken a breath before a new beginning. Julius, holding the tiger cub, joyfully announces the new tenant, while Arya is shocked and angry at the unexpected eviction. He strokes the cub's head with a gentle smile and confidently declares that from now on, the tiger cub will live here, seemingly oblivious to Arya's confusion. Against the backdrop of a majestic castle, a large sign reading, "Devil Prince," appears in the bright sun. The stone towers sparkle, reflecting the rays, and it seems as if the ancient fortress itself holds the memories and secrets of bygone centuries, ready to reveal them only to those who dare to enter. An elegant coat of arms gleams on the wall of the palace hall. A sword in the center, surrounded by the Korean name Sovereign and Heartburn, shimmering in a soft gradient from blue to pink. The evening light bathes the room in warm reflections, and everything around seems to breathe with impending feelings and fateful encounters. A tiger purrs in its cage, and the young prince, lying on a soft carpet, watches it with childish admiration. Every breath he takes merges with the rhythm of the tiger's heart, as if an invisible bond were forged between them, sincere and pure, like the first ray of dawn. Arya thanks Julius for his work. He looks up in surprise and notices a crown appearing right before them, light, as if woven from gold dust. The moment lasts an eternity, and both realize this omen will change everything. With a slight smile, Arya asks if the commander has returned to his room, skillfully concealing her embarrassment. Her voice trembles slightly as she adds that she doesn't believe the rumors about his origins, denying that he could be a prince. Serious and focused, Julius informs Arya that something important has happened. His gaze is clear and direct, and his words, as if carved from stone, make the girl freeze with anxiety and anticipation of the absolute truth. Arya, with a gentle smile, admits she simply wanted to chat with His Highness. Her eyes reflect a playful light, a bit of excitement, and a lot of hidden interest, as if she herself isn't quite sure what she's drawn to. Arya turns sharply, her voice shaking with tension as she addresses him. Your Highness." He responds with a gentle smile, and a mischievous glint ignites in his gaze, promising a conversation that could change everything between them. A man with silver blue hair holds a rose in his mouth and extends his hand to his beloved. His quiet, "darling," sounds like an invitation to dance, and under the golden light of the hall, time seems to stand still, giving way only to feelings. Arya stands in the night garden under the starry sky, amazed and moved. The deep blue light reflects in her eyes, and the entire scene seems woven from silence, anticipation, and a premonition of change. Julius holds the rose up to Arya, and she shyly steps back, catching his playful gaze. His words of admiration are soft, but they convey an unwavering determination to be there, no matter what wall stands between them. Against a light backdrop adorned with gold ornamentation, Julius smiles, holding a rose in his hand. He confesses that he plans to steal her heart this evening, his voice a joke that conceals genuine passion. Julius gestures at Arya with irritation, but with a hint of concern. She, taken aback by his sudden outburst, only smiles sheepishly, unsure how to respond. A tension hangs between them, as thin as a blade. Arya anxiously asks what he's up to. Julius, with his usual playful smile, laments the cruelty of the circumstances that forced him to disguise himself for their meeting. His easygoing demeanor doesn't hide his inner turmoil. He invites her to dance, holding out his palm. His eyes glow with confidence, while hers are filled with uncertainty and anticipation. "Let me show you how wonderful this evening is," he says, and the air between them fills with a barely perceptible warmth. In the spacious living room, filled with a soft glow, they continue their conversation by the open door. Arya speaks quietly of a home full of memories and hopes. Julius smiles and admits that for him, these walls are not just a luxury, but even an untamed part of his own heart. Arya asks in surprise why they're here, looking at the vast, light-filled hall. Julius, politely and with a slight smile, invites her in, as if ready to share the deepest secret hidden behind these doors. He informs Arya that she will now be living here, not in the barracks. His voice is calm but firm, conveying concern rather than command. Arya stands in mute surprise, unsure how to accept this drastic change. In an old mansion, bathed in soft light, three maids smile welcomingly, promising care and attention. Their voices are quiet, almost whispers, as if the very atmosphere of the place dictates softer words. When Julius and Arya meet their gazes, something new is born between them, hesitant but warm, like the beginning of a story. Arya shyly steps back when two maids unexpectedly kiss her cheeks. Her cheeks instantly flush, and a confused look of surprise fills her eyes. Unsure how to respond to this sudden display of warmth, she smiles awkwardly, at a loss for words, as if she can't quite believe what's happening. Later, standing before the mirror, Arya gazes thoughtfully at her reflection, surrounded by solicitous maids. Over dinner, she tries to understand why everything around her seems so mysterious, as if the palace hides a riddle behind every gesture. In the evening, settling into a soft sofa, she finally allows herself to relax, immersing herself in thoughts of the past day. Suddenly, her eyes widen, alarm flickering across her face. She asks sharply if something serious has happened. Her voice trembles, laced with fear that stems not from external danger, but from incomprehension, as if someone nearby is hiding the truth. In another room, a girl with platinum pink hair lies in a luxurious bed, listening to the quiet breathing of the night. She thinks of His Highness and wonders why he hasn't bothered her, why he hasn't indulged in any of the tricks she's become accustomed to. Her heart beats calmly, but her thoughts invariably return to him. Closing her eyes, she quietly asks herself if this isn't some kind of reward. Perhaps this peace is the result of finally allowing herself to believe in good intentions, even if they are born in the shadow of the palace. A gentle tapping sounds in the darkened hall. Someone cautiously enters with a candle. The soft light captures the outline of Julius's face. He walks slowly, as if afraid to disturb a dream or a thought. The night is so quiet, as if it itself guards my secrets, he thinks, looking at the flame barely flickering in his hands. He leans over Arya, concern filling his gaze. His hand rests on the edge of the bed, balancing his thoughts and feelings. Julius's heart beats too fast, as if it wants to acknowledge something he himself hasn't yet dared to understand. In the soft light of the bedroom, he holds her carefully in his arms, as if afraid to disturb the fragility of the moment. Their gazes meet, and the silence of the night is filled with the silver glow of the stars, in which two souls find their silent promise. Arya closes her eyes, feeling the light touch of his hand. It's warm, almost imperceptible, but it makes her heart skip a beat. Every moment stretches on endlessly, and even her breathing becomes a confession, calm and cautious. She's already asleep, lost in peace, and Julius, smiling, quietly extinguishes the candle. The room plunges into semi-darkness, where a soft intimacy reigns. All that remains is the feeling that the night is watching over them both. Under the bright morning sun, the palace garden comes alive. The wind plays with the leaves, golden rays touch the earth, and it seems as if the world itself breathes hope. The new day promises changes that are simultaneously feared and anticipated. Arya wakes, quietly whispering something incoherent, trying to hold on to the remnants of sleep. A soft light touches her face, and a slight smile appears on her lips. Julius enters the room, careful not to disturb the peace, as if afraid to ruin the harmony that had just been born. Under the covers, enveloped in a soft glow, Arya finally awakens fully. The room greets her with warmth and tranquility, and the morning gold streams through the window, filling her silence with a new beginning. She thinks about the upcoming tasks, the meeting, the paperwork, the familiar worries that will bring her back to reality. She lumped to this morning because it smells of something new and tender. Arya gently presses herself against his shoulder, her eyes still closed. I really don't want to get up, she thinks, savoring the moment of peace. The world seems distant and unnecessary while this feeling of warmth and security lingers nearby. Fully awake, she smells a light, unfamiliar scent. Fresh, warm, slightly spicy. What is that smell? She asks, sitting up and looking around with interest. Her fingers brush against the ribbon on her dress, and a slight tremor in her hands betrays her excitement. Julius sits on the bed. He meets her gaze with a barely perceptible smile and says a quiet, "Good morning." His voice sounds sincere, simple, without a hint of arrogance, only warmth and tenderness. The silver blue-haired boy leans forward slightly and asks if she slept well. Arya nods, confused, feeling a slight blush return to her cheeks. The morning light hovers between them, filling the room with a special intimacy. She turns to the window, and the sun's rays glide across her face. She sighs, her shining eyes looking into the distance, as if trying to understand what this unexpected peace will lead to. A tentative but warm hope is born in her heart. The possibility of a new beginning. On the wall, like a reflection of fate, the elegant coat of arms reappears, bearing a sword in the center and the Korean name Sovereign and Heartburn, shimmering in blue and pink. With the ball approaching, Arya stands by the window and watches the sunset, her thoughts quiet, yet filled with a feeling that cannot be hidden by titles or palace walls. The warmth of morning softly enveloped their chambers when Julius, sitting shirtless on the bed, said with a slight smile that he was still asleep, though his eyes were already open. Beside him, under the blanket, a girl with platinum pink hair stirred slightly, as if responding to his words with a soft sigh of sleep. He pressed himself gently against Arya, feeling her breath on his skin, and whispered, not knowing if she could hear, "Do you want to enjoy this moment longer?" She didn't answer, only smiled slightly in her sleep, as if her dreams were an extension of their reality. A young man lay on the cold stone floor, gazing thoughtfully at the ceiling, lost in silence. A chill enveloped his body, and the same question swirled in his head. Why is everything so complicated? Why can't my heart find peace? Memories of her surfaced like the flickering light of a distant flame. Having just woken up, he looked in amazement at the girl still fast asleep next to him. Even half asleep, so powerful, flashed through his mind as he stretched, feeling the morning enter his body. A young man with silver blue hair smiled, adjusting a strand of hair at his temple, and with a touch of irony said into the void, "So, where are all these scoundrels that people love to talk about?" By the window, where sunlight refracted through dewdrops, creating rainbow patterns on the floor, he carefully poured tea. "This tea holds the warmth of the morning and the promise of a new day," he said aloud, as if addressing the morning itself. At that moment, a girl with platinum hair entered the room, and the light seemed to brighten. Arya slowly opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was Julius standing next to her, holding a cup and smiling. "How was your awakening?" he asked, handing her the tea, as if every gesture were part of a silent ritual. In the quiet room, where the air was filled with soft light, he handed her a cup and saucer, and his voice was gentle. "Here." The gesture was simple, but there was a sense of care in it, as if he were passing on not just a drink, but a piece of his own warmth. She stood, looking away, as if trying to figure out what was going on in her heart. Why does it beat so close to him? She whispered to herself. The memory of his smile gently warmed her soul, like the first spring breeze after a long winter. A hand politely offered a saucer, and she carefully accepted the cup, feeling the warmth in her palms. The aroma of freshly brewed tea hung in the air, creating a sense of tender, almost silent communication, where every movement spoke louder than words. They sat side by side in the bright room, holding cups of steaming tea, enjoying the silence that left no need for conversation. The evening light, mingling with the scent of flowers, surrounded them like an embrace. Julius closed his eyes with a slight smile, surrendering himself completely to the moment. "You always smile so calmly," she thought, watching him from the shadows. He opened his eyes and replied softly, "Calmness is a gift I want to share with you." Her gaze was lost in space when a hand gently touched her head. Her heart sank. "Really?" she asked quietly, as if afraid the answer would shatter the fragile illusion. He didn't say a word, only smiled, and his gaze was clearer than any confession. In the morning light, he playfully warned her, "Be careful, you'll spill the tea." She shuddered, taking a step back, clutching her cup tightly, and he laughed as if the whole world revolved around this moment. Arya froze, her eyes wide, her face expressing complete bewilderment, as if she had seen something that could not be explained. The cup shook in her hands, and a puddle of tea spread across the floor. "I didn't notice you come in," she muttered, looking down in embarrassment. He only smiled. "Well, now I've definitely spilled it." She looked at Julius reproachfully. "This only happens to me with you." He sat calmly, holding his cup, as if he knew her outbursts were part of something bigger. He gently took her hand in his, and they sat there, drinking tea in the cozy room, where the soft light and silence created a feeling of security. "Are you always this nervous when we're alone?" he asked. "Maybe," she replied with a hint of awkwardness. "But with you, it becomes a pleasant feeling." The evening garden outside was illuminated by the sunset, and a gentle breeze swayed the flowers. Julius stood by the window, his eyes reflecting the silence. "There's something beautiful in every moment like this," he thought, a smile appearing on his lips. Arya looked ahead, her face a mixture of surprise and alarm, as if something unexpected had just changed the course of their day. Arya and Julius stood in the bright room. She gently asked him to remove his hand, but he only shook his head with a slight smile. The silence of the morning light enveloped them when, as if trying to escape the awkwardness, she suddenly asked about the kidnapping unit. His smile faded for a moment. Julius sat on the balcony, watching two men in dress uniform leisurely discuss the caution required by the presence of foreigners and the recent commoner casualties. The morning was calm, but their voices sounded wary against the majestic backdrop of the palace. He gazed thoughtfully over his cup of tea, as if trying to decipher not just the drink's taste, but what lay beneath it. A bottomless sea of thoughts, each concealing its own secret, was reflected in the depths of his eyes. Taking a light sip, he seemed to seek the answer in the warmth of the drink. Arya adjusted the sleeve of her uniform, and Julius, turning to the window, gazed thoughtfully at the light beyond. "Are you always in such a hurry?" she asked with a slight smile. He didn't answer right away, then quietly said, "I just want to catch the sunrise." She moved closer, feeling the dawn fall across their shadows. The boy held the cup and marveled at how quickly the girl in uniform got ready. Without looking back, she softly said she'd wash it later and confidently headed for the door. Her movements conveyed a firmness of character he still wasn't used to. Julius, holding his cup with a playful smile, reminded her that he'd instructed the maids to complete the task yesterday. His gaze gleamed with warm irony, and his tone was so casual that Arya barely managed to keep from smiling. Arya thanked him for the milk tea, marveling at its unusual taste. Outside, the garden was blooming, and the soft sunlight streaming through the leaves gave the morning a special warmth. Her voice was quiet, as if unwilling to ruin the fragile charm of the moment. A young man with silver blue hair sat by the window, holding an elegant cup of tea. Soft light glided across the curtain, reflecting on his face. He looked calm and pensive, as if every detail of the morning was woven into his thoughts. Julius sipped his tea slowly by the window, savoring the silence. His eyes wandered somewhere far away, deep in his own doubts. He quietly admitted to himself that he wasn't sure, then set his cup down on its saucer, as if ending an invisible conversation. Stretching, the silver blue-haired boy realized he was about to do some serious work for the first time in a long time. The slight gesture conveyed a willingness to embrace the day, no matter what it brought. Against the backdrop of the majestic palace, a quiet confession rang out, filled with uncertainty and a hint of pride. Someone compared him to the royal knights, and he merely chuckled, neither denying nor confirming. The comparison seemed to reflect both the truth and the irony of fate. Two guards in full dress uniform conversed warily at the foot of the stairs. One spoke of the impending event with trepidation. The other tried to remain calm. Flags fluttered above them, and a gentle breeze ruffled the fabric, as if reminding them of the importance of each word. Arya walked confidently ahead of a group of young men in dress uniform. Their gazes followed her, some with respect, others with doubt. She felt their attention, but her step remained steady and confident. The young man, smiling confidently, spoke of his role in the knightly company with a hint of mockery. His laughter was genuine, and his eyes reflected a calm audacity. Every word was laced with self-mockery, turning seriousness into play. Arya gazed thoughtfully out the window, struck by the thought of a woman at the helm. And with a woman at the helm too? She repeated to herself, feeling a hint of doubt and surprise. The light filtering through the glass reflected this inner hesitation, making the moment almost symbolic. Three men in dress uniform were engaged in a lively conversation. One, laughing, declared that even under threat of death, he would not submit to a woman. The other two listened with varying expressions, from irritated contempt to weary agreement. Arya, wearing her dress uniform, entered the room where two officers stood. Their surprise was almost palpable. No one had expected her appearance. She paused, looked at them calmly, and a faint smile touched her lips. Arya, her eyes closed, calmly said that digging in the dirt was not their business. Her voice was firm, and every word was filled with dignity. Those who heard her didn't dare object. In a forest tavern, a group of men merrily drank and raised toasts. Laughter, the clink of glasses, and the aroma of toasted bread filled the air. Their words were simple, but behind them lay a strange, uneasy sense of mirth. In a dark room, 6 girls sat bound on the cold floor. One of them listened anxiously to a voice behind the wall. "We don't have to worry about money anymore." The words sounded eerily calm, causing the others to hold their breath. A woman in a voluminous gown sat on the throne, the embodiment of power and cool calm. The man next to her smirked as he said that, thanks to her, no one would touch them, and that they were incredibly lucky to have pulled it off. A hint of irony flickered in her gaze, but she said nothing. The evening garden was bathed in golden light. She approached the man, holding a medallion in her hands, reflecting his laughing face. Warm, alive, a bottle in his hand. "You always laugh," she said, almost whispering. He looked up and smiled, a little softer than he had a moment ago. Julius stood over Arya, who was sitting on the ground, looking away thoughtfully. "Do you always hide like this?" he asked with a slight grin, peering at her through his monocle. She sighed softly, her gaze fixed on the ground, and replied, "Do you always appear so suddenly?" Arya dropped to one knee and began to explain the plan, but was gently interrupted, asked to take her time. She exhaled, smiled slightly, and said, "Well, at least let me finish my thought." The wind played with her hair, and the sky above seemed especially clear. Julius, looking into the distance, spoke with confidence that there was no one among them who could be his worthy rival. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of challenge in it, as if he genuinely expected someone to risk challenging him. 4 young men in dress uniform stood in a park at night. One of them, wrapped in a red hood, said mockingly, "Just do what you want." The others exchanged glances. There was something challenging yet strangely liberating in his words. 3 young men in dress uniform laughed and exchanged cheerful remarks. Their genuine enthusiasm was infectious. A fourth, standing slightly to the side, hooded, smiled slyly, as if he knew something the others had yet to discover. Julius stood in the night forest, holding an unknown object in his hand. His gaze was focused, his smile dangerously calm. "They think they can get away," he thought, feeling a slight thrill. "But they won't make it today." In the foreground, Arya watched with slight trepidation as a cheerful group of young people mingled in the distance. Their laughter echoed in the castle's evening courtyard, where the wind played with the flowers and flags. "Why are they laughing so carefree?" she thought. "And yet, I seem to be standing apart from it all." Arya and Julius stood on a windswept hill. He, smiling, assured her they would sort out all their problems. She, looking at the horizon, calmly replied that she didn't consider herself involved. A slight, almost playful tension hung between them. Julius, with a playful smile, suggested a competition to see who could score the most. The sun shone high, and the blossoming branches swayed above them. There was a childish playfulness in his voice, and Arya couldn't help but smile. Arya stood by the palace window in the morning light. Her eyes shone with determination as she said clearly, "We are on duty!" Red flowers bloomed behind her, as if emphasizing the power of the moment. Evening was falling over the kingdom, painting the edges of the sky pink and gold. Arya and Julius stood on a cliff. He grinned, throwing a vial down, and somewhere below, a hooded figure fell over in surprise. Arya sighed softly, and Julius said, "Sometimes surprise is the best ally." In the middle of a snowy forest, two men stood with a bottle in their hands, chatting cheerfully. One of them exclaimed, "Hey, look!" and both turned their heads toward the faint crackling of the ice. At dawn, in the light fog over the village, a man in a red cloak and blue uniform walked confidently toward two men. His footsteps echoed hollowly on the damp earth. There was no fear, not a shadow of doubt in his gaze. The evening city was bathed in the soft glow of lanterns. A young man with red eyebrows and a hood stood on the rooftop, his scream piercing the silence. His face expressed a mixture of fury and determination, as if the cry had marked the beginning of a new battle. In the garden, where the soft glow of lanterns intertwined with the scent of cherry blossoms, a bright sign flashed. "Nice to meet you!" Arya stood beneath the blossoming branches, gazing at the stars. A smile lit up her face, as if in that moment she remembered that miracles are possible. The three men, guns in hand, laughed as they discussed the incident and admired the courage displayed. Their laughter overcame their recent anxiety, transforming the tension into cheerful bravado. In the foreground, a young hero in a blue uniform and red cloak parried enemy blows. His sword flashed as it cut through the air. Each swing was precise and powerful, as if he were defending not just himself, but something far more precious. In the evening city, under the soft light of a lantern, the same young man in a red cloak continued the battle, repelling enemies with a single powerful blow. Arya stood nearby, holding her breath, watching him move with precision and courage. "Are you always so brave in defending others?" she whispered, and the wind carried her words away. The image depicts a group of young men in red hoods and carrying swords, rushing forward through a nighttime forest. In the cold silence of the winter night, fate begins its mysterious march once again, and every step leads them toward an inevitable battle. In the foreground, a man in a headband screams in panic, while behind him stand two men in red cloaks with guns. Suddenly, he felt the rules of the game change. "What the hell? What's going on?" he asked, not expecting an answer. A young man in a red cloak swiftly releases an arrow from his bow, in a forest surrounded by shimmering rays of light. He draws the bowstring with determination in his eyes. "Every shot is a step towards freedom," he thinks, feeling the power of the moment. Julius applauds with a smile as he watches the red-cloaked fighters attack, noting their serious attitude that seems to fill the air with energy and determination. A young man with silver blue hair smiles as an aggressive, naked man with a knife rushes at him, screaming. He stands in the shadows of the forest with an easy confidence, as if knowing nothing can break his composure. A man with a shaved head, screaming in pain, stands next to a platinum-haired girl. Her back is turned, surrounded by a blood-red glow and dark roses, as if personifying the mysterious power of the night. Julius and Arya stand in the forest, watching the fallen enemy between them. Julius smiles and says, "You are always stronger than you seemed." And the words ring with deep respect and appreciation. The man in the fur coat is startled to notice that the strangers lack knightly insignia and tries to figure out who they are. In the shadows of the forest, a cold wind whispers through the trees when he suddenly stops and exclaims, confused and wary. Arya stands on the castle balcony in a fighting stance, dagger in hand, surrounded by a vibrant pink-red glow and energy. In this world full of shadows, I must be the light, she thinks, gazing up at the night sky. The image features a black ink stain with red Korean characters on top, adding an air of mystery and tension to the scene. The effect of sharp tension is conveyed by vertical black and white lines, creating a dramatic atmosphere. Arya stands on the palace balcony, gazing at the sunset, her eyes filled with thought and anticipation. A young man in a formal uniform, smiling and with his eyes closed, covers his mouth with his hand, yawning in a bright room. The early morning in the palace is filled with sunlight, and he is trying to gather his strength for the new day. Against the backdrop of the palace, a group of knights in full dress stand guard, while 3 young men in dark robes watch them with a hint of mockery. "Look, thieves," one quietly says, observing the scene. A man sneezes sharply, clenching his white-gloved fist against the sunset sky, as if expressing emotions held back by the full force of the moment. A young man in formal uniform greets the assembled crowd loudly, conveying determination and energy. "Good health!" His voice rings out through the gold-decorated hall, filling the atmosphere with confidence. An officer in full dress uniform, embarrassed and confused, stands in front of a line of soldiers with spears, against the backdrop of the sunset sky, trying not to show his feelings. A young man in a dress uniform raises his hand to his head in surprise, as if trying to comprehend what's happening. "What is this?" he thinks, feeling the tension growing in the air. 4 imperial knights in full dress uniform stand against a backdrop of a bright palace and flowers. "They are the strongest knights of the empire," the red-haired man said, pride in his voice. A girl with platinum pink hair stands with her back to the warm sunset, lost in quiet contemplation. The evening envelops the city in a soft glow, as if whispering of coming changes. She turns slowly, her eyes reflecting a new determination. Julius, with a playful smile, wishes Arya luck, who looks at him with mild surprise and concentration. Their meeting is filled with easiness, promising new challenges and victories. Hidden in the misty forest was a lonely house, which the heroine decided to visit, feeling both anticipation and a slight trepidation. She whispered to herself that she had to meet him, no matter what, and that evening marked the beginning of a change for her. A man with a light stubble blew a whistle with concentration, creating a tense atmosphere in the darkened room. The evening light streamed softly through the window, emphasizing the gravity of the moment and his concentration. A young man with tousled dark hair and a light stubble, wearing an open purple shirt, thoughtfully held the hose of a hookah, slowly inhaling the smoke. His eyes reflected the depth of his thoughts and the slight melancholy of the warm evening. A boy with silver blue hair yawned and greeted the morning, surrounded by a delicate floral pattern. He extended his hand toward the window, letting the first rays of sunlight into the room, and said with a slight smile, "Good morning!" The whisper of nature could be heard in the silence. Julius smiled as he addressed Arya, who was listening attentively at the table in the bright room. His words filled the space with warmth and intimacy, creating an atmosphere of trust. In a bright room, a young man with silver blue hair irritably declared himself bored, while another man laughed off to the side. His lazy leaning back in his chair spoke of an inner search for something more. Julius smiled, looking away against the light, gold-trimmed backdrop. He quietly said, "You've always been my light in this world," his voice trembling with sincerity. The young man with silver blue hair and bright eyes turned in surprise, quietly saying, "What?" His reaction seemed unexpected even to himself. Julius, leaning against the door, looked at Arya with an enigmatic smile, who, slightly agitated, watched him from afar. He quietly admitted that his thoughts were only on her, and a gentle silence fell over the room. Arya felt the warmth of the moment. A thoughtful young man with bright sky-blue eyes stood at the window of a darkened room, looking at the flickering light of the lanterns outside the window, immersed in his thoughts and memories. A stylized logo with a royal sword and ornate patterns appeared before my eyes, surrounded by the words "Sovereign" and "Heartburn" in Korean and English. It was the symbol of a romantic manga about struggle and emotion. The abstract background with vertical lines created an atmosphere of tension and drama. Arya stood by the window, the light softly falling on her face, and a voice inside her wondered, "Why is my heart beating so loudly?" The girl in the red cloak stared ahead with surprise and slight trepidation, against a backdrop of delicate roses. She walked along a quiet alley, leaves crunching underfoot, and suddenly her gaze fell on something unexpected. There were 6 months left until the wedding, and the steps on the soft ground sounded decisive and confident, as if reflecting an inner readiness for a new stage in life. Arya gazed thoughtfully ahead, remembering that the prince, the strongest man in history, had only lost once. This fact evoked mixed feelings in her, respect and doubt at the same time. As Arya cautiously approached the mysterious house, she felt a slight sense of excitement and anticipation. The walls of the house concealed many secrets that she was yet to uncover. Arya and Julius stood side by side on the palace's evening terrace, exchanging soft smiles against the warm glow and golden ornamentation. Arya watched the sunset, her eyes glittering with the last rays of the sun, filled with hope and determination. Near the dark wooden house, Arya listened to the strange sounds coming from within. Evening had fallen over the forest, and the silence seemed thick, like a blanket. She approached boldly, cloaked, ready to face the unknown. In the dark room, light streams through the slightly open door, casting a long shadow on the wooden floor and creating an atmosphere of mysterious anticipation. A girl stands by the door, illuminated by the soft light of the hallway, her figure full of determination. The image shows feet in light pink boots confidently stepping across a dark floor. The quiet evening and the narrow street under the lanterns accompany her steps. Every sound seems to echo her inner strength and determination. Arya peered timidly into the dimly lit room and quietly spoke the name, as if searching for it in the shadows. She said in a measured tone that she was looking for Ritterhagen, her voice trembling with excitement and hope. And then, in silence, with a barely perceptible trepidation, she froze, waiting for an answer. The guy, twirling a chess piece in his fingers, asked almost in a whisper not to call him by his last name, as if wanting to remain in the shadow of his own name. Arya suddenly saluted and hastily apologized, but in the darkness a dry, "Tell me why you came," was heard, and her uneven, "Nice to meet you," dissolved into a tense pause, where only her own heartbeat could be heard. He lay on the sofa, relaxed and tired, and she stood by the door, outlined in soft light. He breathed out softly, "You came so late." And she, holding back a smile, replied, "I needed to see you, no matter what." And the moment between them stretched to a whisper of light on the walls. Arya firmly asked to be accepted as a student, confessing that she must defeat one person at all costs. He, without even turning around, coldly ordered her to leave, as if he had brought down an icy blast on her determination. The girl with platinum pink hair in her uniform trembled slightly, and breaking into an anxious whisper, confessed to the fears that haunted her in this dark room, where the flickering candlelight pushed her to honesty. Arya stared straight ahead, feeling the weight of the unexpected confession on her skin. Her heart was beating too loudly, and the new feeling was both alluring and frightening, leaving her on the verge of taking a step forward. The man with disheveled hair and a light stubble chuckled, covering his mouth with his hand, and calmly, almost affectionately, suggested that they look for another mentor, as if with a gentle joke pushing her away from the threshold. Against the backdrop of the starry sky, she held her gaze, confused and focused, and the endless depth above her made her thoughts clearer. The desire had not disappeared. It had only taken shape. The girl in the cloak, embarrassed, apologized and stepped towards the exit. But a voice from the room, breaking into a scream, panicked and ordered her to stop, as if one movement of hers could change too much. The disheveled man, almost in tears, accused her of hurting his feelings, and this absurd vulnerability suddenly revealed the truth. The coldness in his words had previously been just clumsy armor. Arya, having pulled herself together, said with a slight smile, "Well then." And in this understatement, there sounded an offer to the world, to continue the conversation differently, without running away in jabs. A man in a dress uniform with golden epaulets and a sword recalled his past. The best knight who did not take students. And in this memory, there was a sound of justification, as if an old oath still had a grip on his shoulder. He jerked back, seemingly colliding with an invisible barrier, and Arya, peering around the corner, as if it were a clue she hadn't expected. The guy, trembling nervously, tried to pass by, and she, without losing her gentleness, loosened the slight smile, loosened the invisible knots in the air. Arya pushed him away sharply when he tried to deflect the conversation again, and sternly warned him not to change the subject so suddenly again, her determination now as clear as a blade against its sheath. He lay on the floor, blinking in surprise, and she, standing over him in her cloak, listened to his uneven breathing. With a smile, he acknowledged her strength, not at all childish, and it sounded not like mockery but respect. The guy was breathing heavily, leaning back on the sofa, and she, looking out the window, allowed the silence to keep her thoughts on the right line. Not back, not to the side, only further. In a chair, wearing a luxurious shirt, he took a drag from his hookah and finally asked who she was. The young lady. The smoke melted between them, and the question became the bridge that had been missing from the very beginning. In the semi-darkness, Arya turned to Julius, and without hiding either surprise or hope, quietly called out to him. And the name sounded like a promise of a continuation, in which the answers would no longer be hidden in the shadows. Against the soft light, One hand gently touched the other, and her trembling voice sounded with a firm determination. Forget your doubts, because that guy is a real monster who cannot be underestimated, even if fear tries to stop him. The platinum pink-haired girl confidently said that she had a good reason, and as a knight, she had no right to give up without trying. The evening enveloped the city in warmth, and her words became an oath to herself. In a dark room, a cloaked girl humbly asked to be made his apprentice. She looked down, her voice trembling, and he, peering thoughtfully, seemed to be weighing her resolve and the cost of her request, took his time in answering. He remarked with a playful smile that she was still too young, and at that very moment, the white-haired youth cut through the air with a jerk, rushing forward, as if he himself had answered for her with a movement instead of a word. With her eyes closed, a slight pain on her face, Arya barely audibly whispered, "Young lady." Accepting the weight of an unclear feeling that hurt and called at the same time, in the soft light of the evening courtyard, she said evenly that everything in this life has its price, and her look, full of mystery, became a seal on what she said. The price would be what she was ready to bear. The guy with green eyes and a light stubble smiled thoughtfully and admitted that her mood today was too serious. As if trying to diffuse the silence without breaking its meaning, the green-eyed man ruffled his hair and coldly said that she would pay with her body. The word hit her like a slap, and the air became sharper. But indignation flashed in her gaze instead of fear. An explosion ripped through the darkened room, the walls echoing with concrete. She stood by the window in anticipation, he a step away from a decision, and for a moment, their world cracked, illuminating the line of no return. The silver blue-haired boy broke into a shout, calling her name with fiery determination. "Arya!" cut through the silence, as if trying to hold on for time for her to hear and return. A bright light flashed at the end of the long, dark corridor, and a large red sonic boom sign reflected the very moment of the clash of forces and wills. He cried out her name again, his voice filled with desperation and pleading. She froze. Her heart began to beat in time, and he stepped toward the light, as if to where he could catch up with her, not with his feet, but with the truth. The two laughed together, one pointed forward, both shyly happy, as if they had returned to that place where they could share simple joys and remember one funny line from an old book. A young man with silver blue hair, against a blue sky, with a question mark above his head, wondered out loud. Shadows of doubt flickered in his eyes, trying to understand what was hidden behind her words. Arya and Julius sat next to each other in the dark room by the window, and their shared laughter, born mid-sentence, lit up their faces. In this lightness, there was an agreement to live on, as if the book in their lap had turned the page itself. A girl with platinum pink hair and a man with dark hair stood before a blurry portrait of a child, searching for words. He faltered, she straightened, and in their silence, untold stories and debts yet to be named became apparent. The silver blue-haired boy sat up in bed, his whole body tensing, his eyes gleaming with the determination that morning brings to those who are not used to giving up. Julius stood in the center, shrouded in a mystical glow. Arya and another young man looked at him with alarm, and suddenly something broke. A scream broke, like the boundary between power and its price. On a light coat of arms with a sword and graceful patterns, a sign is frozen, and next to it is a line in Korean and English. Sovereign and heartburn. A symbol of history, where power burns no less than love. Arya screamed in rage, demanding an explanation. Her voice cut through the silence to its foundations, leaving no room for excuses. Now she needed not promises, but the truth. A young man with silver blue hair in a dark uniform took a deep breath at the window where the first stars were shining, and a slight weariness mixed in him with thoughts of what had not yet been said and done. In the dim room, a pink-haired girl leaned over a table with broken glass, two men watching her every move closely, the tension palpable like a thin crack under their fingers. Arya raised her sword before Julius with blazing determination and said she would do anything for their cause, even if giving up her body was just words. And then his surprise turned to action as he extended his hand, taking her oath seriously. Julius confidently led Arya away, ignoring the man's protests behind him. In the dim light of the abandoned warehouse, his quiet, "Let's go," carried more weight than any argument. Arya took a deep breath and spoke her name firmly, like a banner. "My name is Arya, Arya von Winterhart." And her voice rang with a vow to go to the end, not giving in to fate even a step. Smiling with a tired chuckle, Julius watched Arya stubbornly hide behind his back, and hearing her fervent, I'll be back someday," he realized that more than a casual camaraderie had already developed between them. The man with dark hair and green eyes, embarrassed, looked away and raised his hand, asking for a stop, and quietly said that he needed time to understand his own feelings. Arya flushed and sharply denied the accusation, stating that she had not held a sword in her hands for a whole year, and her words cut off the past from returning. Amidst the chaos in the room, a young man with disheveled hair wearily covered his face with his hand and dismissed the subject of the sword, saying that someone else should take care of it, not him. He listened to how they remarked on his well-groomed hands, like a knight's, and nodded thoughtfully, realizing that regular work speaks the truth better than words. Arya, wearing a cloak, rushed towards Julius, who spread his arms with a tired, "You're such a fidget!" while the third man at the window covered his face with his hand, hiding complex feelings behind a familiar gesture. The disheveled young man smiled awkwardly and asked if she would be angry if he admitted that he took care of his nails for women, and his joke gently shifted the stone of tension. Julius looked away, and Arya asked with genuine surprise if he was capable of such a thing, for a woman. And a question arose between them about the price of actions that each person pays for himself. Arya looked at Julius with radiant delight as he, surprised by her gaze, involuntarily retreated into the shadows. Her inner thought of his beauty touched him in confusion faster than words. In the dark room, the man, pondering the problem, said with a slight grin that she seemed to need to just beat this guy, testing not the goal, but the strength of her intentions. Julius calmly said that the crown prince had a weakness, and Arya, amazed, asked again, feeling how the thread of the solution suddenly turned out to be closer than it seemed. The man with dark hair and green eyes, covering his mouth with a thoughtful smile, remarked that the one who first revealed this weakness would win, and his voice sounded like a challenge to fate. The man suddenly drew his sword from its sheath next to Arya, not looking away. She flinched, but did not retreat, and the glint of the blade only emphasized the glint of her determination. In the semi-darkness, with a playful smile and lazy confidence, he said that the young lady would still win, no matter what the difficulties, and this advance of trust fell on her shoulders like a cloak. A man with a slight stubble and a green eye touched his cheek and said almost in a whisper, "Hey, you." And in this timid attempt at attention, there was a hope for an answer that would change everything. A young man with silver blue hair and bright eyes looked forward and quietly said, "Satisfied?" And the evening garden seemed to hold its breath between his words and the soft light of the lanterns. Arya grabbed Julius's hand and, without hiding her anxiety, asked if he was serious, and her unexpected, "Oh, seriously?" sounded on the border between disbelief and hope. In the old room, the heavy wooden door slammed shut, and the silence cracked, echoing in the corners like a warning. He said with a playful smile that he didn't throw words in vain, and at that very moment the glass with the photograph burst, showering the floor with sharp sparks of the past. In a glass capsule, two men lay side by side. The older one, with a lazy smile, teased the younger one, calling him a brat, while the younger one winced in irritation, unable to hide his childish stubbornness. Against the backdrop of the luxurious hall, Arya, rubbing the back of her head, thought angrily how annoying it all was, and tried to contain her growing irritation while the music and gilding pretended that everything was fine. A small boy pressed himself tightly against the leg of a man in dress uniform in a bright, high-windowed room, and in that silent gesture there was more of a request than in any words. The man with dark hair and green eyes peered anxiously into the light, hesitating to take a step. Doubt trembled in his pupils like a shadow from a curtain. The young man with silver blue hair, surprised by his own tenderness, barely audibly said, "Grandpa," and the word fell into the room so softly, as if it had brought back someone from memory. The girl with white hair and bright blue eyes, surrounded by flowers, blushed and smiled, and her surprise quietly lit up her cheeks. The man in the dress uniform looked anxiously at the frightened boy hiding behind his leg, and realized that he had to be stronger than the gold and glass around him. In the palace, the crowned emperor called loudly for Julius, peering into the faces of the servants, and his voice rang with impatient concern that did not tolerate an empty answer. At the evening ball, a man with green eyes, slightly embarrassed, smiled under the soft candlelight, letting the music cover up his awkwardness. A man in a ceremonial uniform dropped to one knee before the elegantly dressed child and quietly spoke words of respect that were both protective and promising. The same green gaze gently consoled the young man with silver blue hair, saying that it could be difficult with parents, but it was worth being patient until adulthood because the mourning was inevitable. The warrior easily lifted the boy and, smiling, offered to surrender and return to his father, as if offering a respite before a real fight. The young man with silver blue hair said, "It's no use," in a subdued tone, and the shadow on his face showed that the decision was deeper than it seemed. He, amidst the golden roses and light patterns, quietly said that this did not suit him, and a slight sadness gave the words the form of a refusal without anger. A man with long dark hair asked his companion if he could leave the young man alone, and the question expressed respect for the right to silence. On the coat of arms with the sword, the name Sovereign and Heartburn shone in blue and pink tones, as a sign of history, where power and feeling burn equally, and it is too late to retreat. Julius spotted Arya by the tree, and smiling with relief, exclaimed joyfully that he had finally found her, as if the long circle of searching had closed in one clear moment. A young man with silver blue hair sat by the palace window, immersed in an ancient book, catching the soft light of dawn. Thoughts of the world's mysteries rang softly between the lines. The young man lay relaxed on the grass, and the boy with the book, without looking up, answered his good-natured question with a challenge. "What can you learn from those who cannot look beyond the page?" Julius turned the pages with a touch of sadness, and Arya, looking at him softly, noted his indifference to the contents. "I don't need them," he said, and silence fell between the lines. The boy deftly intercepted the falling book and, looking in surprise at the stranger in the glove, asked what he was going to do with it, while the golden crowns of the trees in the garden swayed in the wind. Julius grabbed Arya roughly by the collar, then threw her to the ground with cold calm, holding the book in his other hand. The sunset cast a harsh light across the alley, emphasizing the abruptness of the gesture. The red-haired man confidently declared his victory, looking at the silver-haired youth next to him. The autumn light filtering through the leaves made his smile especially confident. Lying in a field of golden wheat, Julius looked up at the sky with quiet admiration, feeling the lightness of the moment, as if the world had frozen in anticipation, and whispering, he would call her to share this peace. The silver blue-haired boy watched as the man in the red uniform walked away with the book, throwing a word over his shoulder about confiscation. The autumn leaves swirled slowly, and peace did not return. The young man in formal attire suddenly exclaimed in shock and anger, and the drawn-out, "What?" sounded like a discharge on a taut string. The man called to the boy, who took off running towards him, but suddenly fell and disappeared into the light. A moment later, they were racing through the garden, laughing, as if the light had returned them to a carefree state. A large red inscription flashed against the black background, and the evening garden with lanterns seemed to fall into verse. Arya stood by the blossoming cherry tree, looking at the falling petals, in the silence of meaning. Against the backdrop of a luxurious hall, one man calmly asked another to stop, reminding him of his status as crown prince. The response was a dry, "All right," as if that was what duty demanded. The young man in the crown sat detachedly on the pedestal. The crowd around him didn't know how to address him. The titles were loud, the words were empty. The dark blue, fading into black, held the night in the air. She stood by the window and peered out at the city, where the rare lights seemed like alien thoughts. Dressed in his dress uniform, with gold epaulets and a black glove, he smiled thoughtfully, leaning on his arm and holding a book. The soft sunlight made this pause almost a confession. The hero's eyes widened at the sudden warning of an intrusion into the crown prince's chambers. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, and the air grew thicker. He ran through the empty streets of the city at night, the flickering lanterns catching his breath. Determination and anxiety walked side by side, not giving way to each other. The door swung open, and a man in a cloak burst into the dark room. "Julius!" sounded loud, like a name key that removes the bolts of silence. A man with long dark hair, against a red-black gradient, looked on with obvious fear. The garden whispered with the water of the fountain, but the alarm sounded louder. Arya and Julius stood close, exchanging soft smiles in the warm light, and the gold ornaments seemed to echo their thought. There is a promise in every glance. Bright blue eyes gleamed in the darkness. A hand to her lips held a deliberate silence, as if a word could disturb the fragile order of the night. On the balcony, a boy with a sword and blue eyes called out to Julius. His voice trembled but held firm, and the stars heard fear give way to plea. A man in dress uniform, worried and surprised, stood against a light background. The knight and the hall argued about the truth he had to accept. On his knees, sword in hand, he said that he had no need of anyone weaker, the words sounding firm, like an oath given to himself. A young man with dark hair played the flute in the soft light, the music gently conveying what language feared to name. Against the sunset, Julius looked ahead and Arya looked away. He confessed he was afraid of losing her. She whispered she would fight. and the evening accepted their words. Arya, embarrassed, tried to get his attention, her voice trembling with the desire to tell the truth. The wind played with the leaves, as if urging her to take the first step. Julius looked down, hiding the tremor in his voice, and admitted his fear. Arya extended her hand and quietly replied, "Then stay close." And the pause became the answer. The girl with platinum pink hair turned sharply at the footsteps of a dark cloak in the golden sunset. "For me?" she asked, barely audibly, and the shadow answered as if it had come precisely for this. A close-up of a bright blue eye captured a quiet thoughtfulness and a slight sadness. He stood on the edge between the past and the present, peering into a foggy future where her image flickered like a light in the night, and wondered why his heart was so restless. Arya gently held his hand, and Julius, with a playful smile, asked why she was suddenly so interested in him. Her silence said more than any explanation. Arya was surprised to see his smile as he gently squeezed her fingers and quietly said that she had always been a light to him, and for a moment, the autumn forest became their shared silence. In his dress uniform, on a simple bed, Julius tossed and turned desperately and loudly complained about the lack of comfort, as if arguing with fate for the right to an extra pillow. With a slight smile, Arya called him annoying, and he calmly replied that it didn't matter. The sunset colored their gaze with warmth, where teasing became intimacy. Julius covered his face with his hand wearily. Sometimes everything seems too complicated. And she gently tugged at his sleeve and reminded him that he was not alone, because she was near and heard his silence. Against the backdrop of the sunset, he quietly recalled the formation of the Imperial Guard, squeezing his hand in distant memory. Dates and names burned into one thing. The price of duty is always higher than peace. With a sly grin, he asked if the imperial decree frightened her. Arya shuddered, looked around, and replied that it was hardly that simple, and he looked at the horizon, as if it were the line where prepositions vanished. They walked shoulder to shoulder, and the slightest touch became a confession. She quietly said that she had long dreamed of walking with him like this, and he smiled in response, acknowledging this evening as the most precious. Two hands met in the soft light and lingered in contact, where trembling and determination met. He extended his fingers, she responded with a smile, and the air accepted their agreement. In the golden sunset, Julius asked with a sad smile if she thought he wasn't good enough. Arya was surprised and looked straight ahead, as only someone who believes can, and the question vanished. Arya peered thoughtfully into the distance, as if catching in the flickering light that single word that explains the way when the maps are silent. Smiling reservedly, she said that he was not a mentor to her, but a rival, and did not let go of his hand. In this address, there rang the sound of fair play without shields. He stopped suddenly, feeling a change in the air, and silently admitted to himself that his heart beat strangely when she was near. Memories of her surfaced like warm water. Arya said it was okay to laugh, but her gaze remained serious and slightly embarrassed. The autumn light accepted her vulnerability as strength, not weakness. A smiling Julius stood among the flowers in the spring garden and admitted that spring always reminds one of a beginning that does not need to be explained in words. 5 young officers in dress uniform exchanged glances against the backdrop of the castle. The morning brought trials, and their surprise, a willingness to face them together. Arya looked ahead with shining eyes, and Julius watched her with a quiet smile. The anticipation in her gaze became for him the answer to the question of the meaning of the journey. With a playful smile, he spread his arms and asked to be taken care of. The request sounded like a joke, but hidden within the joke was a real request. In the moonlight, the 2 men in the room exchanged brief glances. The one in the cloak calmly asked for a sack of gold, adding that the matter should be left to him, and the dull copper of the coins gleamed like the seal of a promise. A boy with bright blue eyes and a playful smile crossed his gloved hands against a shimmering blue light, his quiet thought echoing an acceptance of a world where every step is a choice and every game is serious. The elegant sword crest gleamed with the name Sovereign and Heartburn in Korean and English, like an emblem of history where power and emotion inevitably collide and burn. In a luxurious castle, a man in a dark cloak carefully made his way to the door, marveling at the ease of entry into a place where sounds whisper and shadows guard peace. The young man smiled thoughtfully and whispered to himself, "Now how should I do this?" Feeling the anticipation quicken his pulse and push him to make a decision. The platinum pink-haired girl screamed, and the dark-haired boy turned around in shock. Her desperate cry, addressed to the heights of the title, split the hall like a crack in glass. Julius, savoring the pie with a carefree smile, did not notice how Arya was rapidly approaching, and someone else's shadow slid along the wall, leaving a cold mark on the warm evening. Arya angrily reached for the pie, while Julius, carrying the delicacy, calmly walked away. In the portrait, the chef smiled and asked not to overexert herself, turning the chase into a playful ritual. Julius complimented the pie's beauty with a playful smile, and Arya chided him for his irritating words. Their exchange was filled with the familiar tenderness of one who never backed down first. In the hall, the young man suddenly covered his ear, catching the sound of quick footsteps, and darted behind a column. His heart skipped a beat as a voice behind him laid out new rules for the game. In a narrow alley, a guy in a dark hoodie breathed heavily and cursed under his breath. The dim light of the streetlights emphasized each damn like a mark on a route. At the luxurious door, a young man in a cloak darted his gaze, seeking shelter. Someone's footsteps were already approaching, and the evening gold of the halls became too bright for a secret. Dressed in his wedding attire, Julius announced with a laugh that the dress sample was ready, and Arya peeked out from behind the door with a smile. The slight absurdity made the moment almost homely. The bright-eyed boy hid around the corner, determined to observe the crown prince without revealing himself. His patience stretched taut like a bowstring. The lace and beads quietly caught on the wooden frame, and a barely audible sound drew attention to the delicate detail, as if pointing to the line of fate. A sharp tug, a clawed hand tore at the decoration, and a cry split the hall. The fabric gave way, leaving a mark, like a scar on the event. The cloaked man peered fearfully out from behind the door into the bright, arched hall, and thought that this was clearly not the place for him. But it was too late to retreat. Among the knight's armor, he saw with alarm how a girl in a crown suddenly fell. He approached and asked if she needed help, and her whisper was heavier than all the gilding around. The king, with silver blue hair and mustache, froze in shock, his eyes widening as if the world had stepped too close. The majestic hall filled with screams and splashing water. The cloaked man waved his arms helplessly, and the tearful king tried to shield himself as the silence crumbled like a torrent. In the palace corridor, the young man realized with horror that his face was exposed. The guards' footsteps were already rushing past, and the king's defenses had turned the corridor into a narrow escape route. The anticipation thickened against the vertical black and white lines as Arya walked slowly down the garden path toward Julius, the air between them ringing like a string about to strike its first note. In the dark room, Julius leaned on his knees, catching his breath and thinking only one thing. He was safe now, and for the first time in a long time, this thought did not seem like a lie. The hooded youth sat on the floor, exhaled irritably in the softly lit room, and threw a short, "What's wrong?" into the void, as if demanding answers from the silence. A man with a stern gaze sharply asked who stood before him, warning that this was no place for commoners. The frightened youth screamed and recoiled, as if he had run into an invisible wall. On the Sunset Street, a guy in a brown raincoat stumbled, turned around with wide eyes, and stammered a hasty, "Sorry," trying to keep his balance and face. Arya extended her hand and smiled warmly, asking if everything was all right, her calm stronger than any armor. In the stained-glass hall, Arya von Winterhat leaned over a young man in a dark cloak. Julius Otis Rosenberg lay wounded beside him, and the sunlight counted down the seconds until a decision from which there was no turning back. The guy with black hair jerked his head sharply from one side to the other, frozen between confusion and irritation, like between a door and a step. He pulled away abruptly and flared up. "Rude!" And the girl with pink hair only watched in amazement as the offense rushed faster than the meaning. Arya cheerfully caught the surprised Julius, who, losing his footing, almost slid to the floor. Laughter made them lighter than the evening light, and the room exhaled for the first time. Arya, smiling, reached out to the running child, and the man next to her watched with gentle surprise how joy always chooses movement. Against a backdrop of lilies and cherry blossoms, Arya warmly advised her interlocutor not to commit any more bad deeds, and her calm tone sounded like the best possible sentence, without trial, but according to conscience. The young man with black hair and green eyes looked sheepishly at the heart flying toward him. The evening wind caught the symbol as if it belonged there, between fear and a smile. Arya shouted after the retreating man, trying to stop him, and her voice pulled the path back, where a word could still rewrite a step. At night, under the stars, a young man in black gloves climbed the balcony of a luxurious building. Despair and fear stole his breath, but the height had already become a goal, not an obstacle. In a quiet room, the young man watched the sleeping girl with pink hair in a halo of flowers and soft light, and thought, why does tenderness always find its way, even in those who come from the shadows. With a playful smile, Julius whispered whether she was not feeling well, asleep with her head against his leg. Her breathing was even and calm, and the concern in his voice touched her more quietly than the moon touched the windowsill. Against a light background with blue highlights, a gloved figure dropped to one knee. The gesture conveyed a request, a confession, and a choice that could not be left to someone else's lips. A close-up of a bright blue eye held echoes of the unspoken. The gaze stretched into the distance, where every decision began with self-honesty. The palm carefully touched the blade of the sword, and a quiet ringing raised a memory from the depths, like an oath from which neither time nor night can free. The young man at the open window let out a desperate cry of "Mama," and the darkness responded with emptiness. His heart sank, but his voice could no longer return to the silence. Julius looked quietly at Arya, sleeping in the moonlight, and thought that her calm held this world together better than orders and banners, as if silence had finally become an ally. He gently ran his hand through her hair, and the next moment, without waking, she grabbed him by the throat. Her astonishment gave way to the understanding that even in her sleep, her warrior reflex protected her. Under the night sky outside the mansion, the carriage stood like a shadow on the gravel. Someone was climbing up from the second-floor window, and a white tiger on the grass made that night a legend until dawn. A girl and a boy held a teddy bear together. Their hands touched, and they found the simple truth of intimacy where words usually get in the way. The girl with white blue hair and blue eyes seriously ordered that the right person be called immediately. Her voice brought order to the panicked room. Dressed in an elegant gown and holding a teddy bear, she quietly but firmly declared that nonsense would not be tolerated in the palace, and the stained glass windows seemed to agree, casting colorful shadows of order onto the floor. Dressed in a lace dress and a hat with roses, she sipped her tea with her eyes closed, letting the morning last as long as it needed to, so that the day would not be mistaken in tone. Arya, hiding her embarrassment, looked at the dessert that was served, and heard her own thoughts, like the clatter of a spoon on porcelain. "Why is my heart beating so fast?" And smiled, accepting the simple happiness. In a gazebo among the lavender fields, Arya and the girl in pink enjoyed their tea in silence. The soft sun made the pause meaningful, not empty, and that was all they needed. On the coat of arms with a sword, decorated with a fine ornament, the inscription, "Sovereign and Heartburn," shimmered, like the seal of history, where power and emotion inevitably collide and leave a mark. Arya happily remarked on the beautiful weather, but Julius, quietly interrupting the table with tea and desserts, gently brought the conversation back to the point, and her smile became calmer than the morning. A graceful box stood among the flowering branches, and a simple confession about a dislike of jam was made, a detail that unexpectedly made the conversation lively and honest. In the bright winter garden, Arya coldly ordered another drink. Julius watched from a distance, with a slight smile, as her sternness was based on concern, not caprice. A girl in an elegant dress with a teddy bear asked Arya, who was guarding her brother, and having confirmed her title of Empress, she was met in response not with servility, but with calm confidence. Arya, amazed and alarmed, turned to her interlocutor. Her voice wavered but did not break, maintaining a balance between duty and that which could not be said aloud. A girl with white hair and blue eyes, wearing a hat and flowers, looked into the distance at dawn, clutching an ancient locket. Memory lay on top of hope, like light on the palm of a hand. In a gazebo amidst a blooming garden, Arya and Julius spoke seriously. The maid, smiling, watched as the question of submission and marriage revealed a depth in which duty was only one reason. On the balcony, the girl listened to the whisper of the wind among the plants with a slight smile, accepting the silence as the right to think without haste. The girl in the dress and hat, clutching the teddy bear, silently personified the prince's sister. Not just a title, but a responsibility one doesn't run from. At the garden table, the confession was quiet. She had always thought him unattainable, but now she saw in him a man with fears and dreams. He lowered his gaze, and the rainbow of light became softer. Arya spoke firmly of her devotion, looking to the side at the bright sky. Her loyalty sounded without vows, like a breath that never ends. The girl in the lace hat, holding a teddy bear, repeated in amazement, "Dedicate yourself!" And the exclamation became the first step towards understanding the value of the promise. The blue-eyed girl worriedly thought that her brother had forced someone to agree, and her suspicions took shape like the shadow of a cloud on the snow. Arya, focused and surprised by her seriousness, tried to grasp why the silence around her had become denser. As if the meaning stood nearby, without naming itself, Arya thought with disbelief that anyone could agree to marry the strange Julius, and yet a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. There was room for hope in this doubt. A girl in a dress and hat, clutching a teddy bear, anxiously asked if her interlocutor was serious in his intentions. The answer she was expecting should have been clearer than titles. Arya firmly challenged him, and Julius, playing with the teddy bears, asked if she was ready to give her life to him. The little princess listened to their words in tears, like fate choosing a voice. The boy grabbed the girl in the white bonnet with a sharp movement and anxiously asked if she was okay. A moment kept them on the brink of falling and being saved. The blue-eyed girl, lying in Arya's arms, asked in a near whisper if she couldn't be saved. The answer was quiet and direct. Salvation was possible if she believed. In him and in herself, and her weak smile marked the beginning of hope returning. Arya, noticing Julius collapsed unconscious in the snow, scooped him up and hugged him tightly. The cold burned her palms, but the fear burned even more, and she whispered his name as if it could bring back his breath. "Where are you from?" Arya asked in surprise, watching Julius calmly devour the treats while the little sister in his arms angrily protested. He, without looking up, replied with playful innocence that he had been invited to sample the best dessert in the palace. Squeezing the hand of the girl in the pink dress, Arya confidently said that it was too early to part with life, and warned, "Remove a man's face and wealth, and troubles will reveal his worth, not his brilliance." He took a thoughtful bite of the pie and chuckled to himself. If you stare at someone's face for too long, it stops seeming so beautiful. Habit erases the halo faster than time. The blue-eyed girl in the lace dress whispered sadly about her cake, holding back tears. She looked down to keep them from falling, and the sweetness suddenly tasted salty. Julius instantly felt an ominous shadow behind him, but before he could turn around, Arya grabbed him by the uniform, shouted, "Retribution!" and was the first to rush into battle, like a flash in the snow. Looking ahead with a focused gaze at the clear sky, Arya made a decision. In a world where every step changed her destiny, she would not allow herself the right to doubt. Only one step, only further, only for them. The girl with white hair and blue eyes, clutching a teddy bear to her chest, looked away and held back tears. In the silence of the garden, the toy became the only witness to her loneliness. Arya carefully carried the dessert through the morning garden and looked around thoughtfully. It seemed that even the birds were listening to her steps, understanding that this small gesture was more important than loud promises. Arya dropped to her knees, pushed a small cake towards the girl with the teddy bear, and quietly said, "From now on," putting into her half-word a promise to be there, without reservations. The girl with platinum pink hair smiled, handed over the cake, and nodded briefly. She will serve as a knight, simple, like an oath without witnesses, and strong, like the hilt of a blade. With a soft blush and shining eyes, she looked away. Her heart began to beat faster, as if the spring wind had momentarily become too warm for a winter morning. Dressed in a delicate pink dress, she held a plate with a small cake and a teddy bear, and the whole scene looked like childhood waiting to be protected. By the stained glass window, where the light shattered into pink hearts, Arya timidly touched Julius's cheek with a kiss and whispered, "Thank you for everything you've done for me." And he only exhaled, as if he had been waiting for these very words for a long time. Arya looked at him so warmly that her eyes spoke more than confessions. The air around became soft, and the feeling finally found a name without fear. The little king, trembling, asked if he really must knight Arya to Yuno. His hand trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from understanding the price of the promise. The girl in the lace dress and hat with roses smiled and addressed her father tenderly. Her voice was firm and soft, like a promise made not out of whim, but out of love. "So?" Julius asked with a playful smile, and the blue-haired girl, lost in the dark mystical penumbra, quietly thanked him, as if gratitude were her shield and sword. The little figure in the royal robe burst into tears, crying out about the strange choice. The tears were not weakness, but proof that the decision was truly momentous. The elegant logo with the royal sword once again sparkled with the words "Sovereign" and "Heartburn," a sign of history, where oaths, love, and power inevitably become entangled, but everything is decided by the one who does not retreat. In the throne room, Arya and Julius stood before the crowned child, and the cloaked youth with a sword asked in confusion how it all came to this, as if trying to catch up with the meaning of the event on the run. Against the backdrop of the luxurious hall, Arya stubbornly refused, and Julius and the two men looked at her with a mixture of surprise and alarm. realizing that her no had already launched a new line of fate. The girl in the elegant hat with flowers yawned quietly, covering her mouth with her hand, and the morning, flowing through the stained glass windows, became softer than her drowsiness. In the ballroom, couples in masks twirled, and the eye kept returning to the duet in lilac and black. The upcoming selection of the best couple promised to be more than just a game of etiquette. The blue-eyed, white-haired girl, wearing a lace dress with a rose on her hat, confidently declared that she was perfect for the role of Mrs. Arya, and her tone sounded not like a request, but like responsibility. "What's all this talk about?" Julius asked, surprised, while Arya, nervously choosing her words and aware of her lateness, tried to explain more than would fit in a sentence. The girl in the elegant dress slowly descended the stairs, and behind her came the calm comfort that makes steps smoother than music. Arya and Julius held hands, their gazes downcast, their quiet closeness speaking for both of them like a signature without unnecessary titles. Amid the roses, a girl with a tender smile, gently touching his hand, promised to save him from his brother. The promise sounded like a bloodless sword, and sharp enough. Hearing "cutie," Arya looked away shyly and held back her emotions. Rose petals fell to the floor as quietly as confessions that take time. Arya watched the maid and the girl leave and quietly offered to call Noah. This simple sentence felt warmer than any command. "Am I dreaming?" Arya breathed out, confused, and Julius scratched his head and smiled uncertainly. Their awkwardness was more honest than any confident yes. An elderly nobleman in formal attire carefully held a child in a robed and crowned robe, and quietly said that action would have to be taken. The child asked in surprise, "What about?" And the hall grew quieter for a moment. A white boot stepped confidently across the floor, and the words about dance rehearsals acquired a rhythm, like a decision that the body had already learned. Julius, smiling, extended his hand and said that he wanted to be near. Simply, without rhetoric, the way one says things that do not argue with the heart. In the luxurious hall, Arya flinched at the unexpected touch and gasped widely. The golden light caught her surprise and turned it into a smile. Having energetically commanded everyone to line up around Julius, who was sitting on the throne, Arya suddenly realized the full scale and was horrified. He would have more work, and this was now her responsibility too. Julius said goodbye with a slight smile, promising to see each other soon. The promise sounded as if the short separation was just a breath before continuing. Arya watched as he raised his hand and walked into the hall, where the soft light shimmered like a rainbow. The gesture assigned to her that they were walking into the same dawn. She closed her eyes and said softly, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." And the warm light in the room took in the thought as the promise of a new beginning. Julius, with a playful smile, said that he was merely being prudent. And when asked, "Where exactly?" he answered just as easily, "Where the stakes are higher than whispers and lower than loud oaths." In the spacious hall, under the moonlight, they held hands and remained silent. The piano music barely touched the air, and that was enough for the confession to sound without words. The night blazed with fireworks, carriages rumbled up to the palace, and the masquerade ball opened its doors as wide as if it was going to hide from the world everything that had not yet been decided. The red-haired boy burst into tears of admiration, exclaiming how beautiful she was, while the silver-haired boy behind her smiled, letting his admiration sound in place of any comment. The girl in the red and white dress with flowers looked thoughtfully to the side. In a gentle glow, her inner voice acknowledged, "Today is the day when everything will begin to be called by its proper name." Arya stood before the two men with a slight smile. One cried out in surprise, the other gently rebuked him, and her calm set the roles more accurately than any titles. He held out an elegant mask, looking at her warmly, and whispered, "It is a sign of mystery and beauty that he wants to share only with her." She was embarrassed and replied that his care made the evening special. Arya accepted the gift from Julius, a blush crossing her cheeks, and the redhead, watching, wiped away tears of delight, as if the vision had finally coincided with reality. They stood very close in their masks, and he quietly said that it was time to go. Their distance was less than a breath, and their agreement was clearer than music. Arya turned sharply to Julius, who had suddenly appeared, and asked ironically if he always appeared so unexpectedly. He smiled, only when he really needed to be there. Wearing a mask and uniform among the flowers, he greeted those gathered with confidence. And Arya, amazed, had time to think only one thing. His role is always half a step ahead of events. With the same playful smile, he asked if all this was still for his sake. The mask did not hide the slight hope woven into the question. Arya playfully asked why he was acting like this. He answered just as confidently, while a third person, off to the side, watched with a conciliatory smile. The scene was already sounding like a duet. A black-gloved hand extended a flower mask. The other reached out cautiously. The soft light sealed the gesture like a wordless vow. He leaned over and whispered that she wouldn't believe it anyway. At a ball with crystal chandeliers, this half-joke sounded like an invitation to test him seriously. With a flower mask on her wrist, Arya couldn't help but shout, confirming her resolve. She wouldn't let him get away with it today. The masked man, with a warm, playful smile, promised to dance to prove his feelings. In a way that would leave no one in doubt, Julius spun around confidently and dazzlingly, exclaiming that everything was for her. Arya watched in amazement, and the audience seemed to truly believe his first steps. They left together. He said this seriously. She quietly reciprocated, and the two, remaining behind, smiled, like witnesses of a correctly chosen path. As they walked down the stairs to the fountain hall, among the dancing and chatting guests, their eyes met, and the soft light recognized their decision as the best secret of the evening. Arya, wearing a mask and a fluffy dress, holding the hand of her companion, was surprised to note how large the crowd was. The light, music, and whispers of masks formed a sea of faces, where every glance promised something. Wearing their masks, they walked side by side with Julius. He readily agreed that now was the best time for fun, and his glove touched the purple flowers, as if cementing this evening as their secret sign. By the stairs, two children in masks chatted cheerfully with adults. Candles and music kept the hall in a warm semi-darkness, where laughter sounded purer than titles and duties. Arya and Julius drew glances as they walked through the room. "This will be an unforgettable evening," he said with a smile, and she, with restrained surprise, agreed. The atmosphere was already doing its job. He saw someone's hand reach for a glass and followed her gaze. Soft light filled the room, and his heart began to beat faster as she approached, bringing with her a slight sense of unease and clarity of choice. Julius, wearing a mask, smiled at Arya, wearing a red mask. "You look amazing," he said, and she sighed slightly, not looking away, wondering why his voice found her so confidently. Arya tried to get his attention in an irritated manner, but he suggested a dance competition instead of the usual dance, turning the game in their favor. He explained the rules simply. The first one to let go of his partner loses. The joke held a confession more easily hidden in a step than in words. Against the backdrop of the sunset, their gazes met very close. "Do you know why I came here?" he whispered, and the anticipation between them became almost tangible. He looked at her with a quiet laugh, and the mask only emphasized this look. The game had begun, and no one wanted to give in. A masked girl danced with a young man in formal attire. She has no equal in dancing, she thought, feeling the lightness in every step. "You are like light," he said, holding her hand tighter. A young man in a mask led a girl in a fluffy dress and wondered when his sister would realize that his brother wasn't perfect and would still come running to him. Such are the laws of family dramas set to music. In a floral pattern of light, Julius, slightly bowing his head, whispered, "In this dance, I want to be only with you." And the gaze behind the camera received its answer without words. With a playful smile, he whirled around, surrounded by admiring masks. The flickering candles, the whisper of silk, and the lightness of his step made his confession part of the rhythm. The sword crest shimmered with the words, "Sovereign and Heartburn," as Arya watched the sunset from the window, realizing that power and emotion rarely danced in opposite directions. Wearing a mask and with flowers in her hair, Arya, smiling, calmly explained something to two girls. Their admiring glances said that true strength lies in simplicity and clarity. Arya spun around in surprise, trying to compose herself. The music carried her, and the mask allowed her to hide the excess, leaving only what really needed to be said. They were dancing when a figure in black clawed gloves emerged from the shadows. The audience held its breath for a moment, and their steps became more careful. Beauty needs protection. A red shoe with a white lace toe touched the floor softly. The summer light warmed the memory of the moment, like a promise that the step had been taken correctly. In the foreground, two masked figures unexpectedly came face to face, while in the background, Arya von Winterhat and Julius Otis Rosenberg danced with grace and passion. The meeting of eyes became the beginning everyone had been waiting for. Julius told Arya with a playful smile that she was doing well, leaving room in his tone for encouragement and a slight challenge. Arya, wearing a mask and a ceremonial uniform, with a tense face, demanded seriousness, internally gathering her willpower so as not to allow the evening to turn into a game without rules. In the luxurious hall, masked men carefully supported the tired ladies and quietly discussed the seriousness of the situation and the upcoming rounds, where every step could be decisive. Arya and Julius watched as three figures swirled in the whirlwind. One challenged him and asked if he could hold out. Another sharply shouted, "Stop!" and the air grew taut. The masked girl with blue eyes and silver blue hair looked up in amazement at the dark blue curtain and chandelier, as if searching for an answer above their heads. A masked young man with green eyes and blonde hair turned to the blue-haired girl in confusion, and their meeting in the golden light became the beginning of a new question. In the hall, the masked girl breathed a sigh of relief and reassured the young man. There was nothing to worry about. Her confidence restored the music's rhythm. The girl with silver blue hair, wearing an elegant mask, lowered her gaze and drowned in thoughts. A quiet voice nearby did not dare disturb her reverie and only asked, "Why now?" The elegant shoes glided lightly and quickly across the floor. The step flowed into a dance, and the hall responded with a whisper of silk. The girl in the mask with blue hair and a bow turned around in confusion. From behind, a guy was holding her hand tightly, and the surprise was stronger than words. Julius's hand gently touched Arya's waist, inviting her to dance under the shimmering lights and petals. "Let me lead you," he said, and the movement itself responded with consent. Arya extended her hand in invitation, and Julius, momentarily surprised, nevertheless accepted her gesture. The thought flashed through his mind. This evening really could change everything. Arya von Winterhot smiled mysteriously through her elegant mask, hiding the unnecessary, leaving only the intention. On the bright staircase, a girl in a blue dress and a young man in a light suit were talking excitedly. A hand in a pink sleeve lay on the floor. Carefully, but without panic, they were reassured that everything was all right and help was at hand. The masked girl with blue eyes and blue hair looked at the man standing next to her with slight trepidation. Her heart skipped a beat, but her steps remained steady. The best couple of the evening was announced to applause. "This dance was for you," he whispered. She smiled and admitted that she felt his warmth in every movement, and he that, with each step, his faith grew stronger. In the center of the hall, under the spotlight, three people stood. The guests watched with interest, and on the balcony, two masked people looked down. The stage was preparing to say what words cannot say. On the balcony, Arya and Julius quietly discussed the defeat, and he confidently noted that it didn't count. The game was longer than one round. Arya, wearing a mask, thoughtfully noted. Her sister's involvement immediately connected her to the Emperor. The threads became more numerous, the knot tighter. Wearing masks, a young woman in blue and a young man in light clothing received applause. The voting rules were explained to the guests, and the evening softly descended upon the hall, registering the elections and promises. The masked man with silver blue hair quietly remarked that he would have to find out more about Yuno in the future, as if drawing the line between guess and intention. Julius looked closely at Arya, whose mask barely concealed her confusion and embarrassment. "Why are you hiding?" he said softly, and her silence sounded louder than the answer. They met at a masked ball, and despite the secrecy of the moment, Arya spoke first. "Even if so," and the music retreated for a moment, giving way to meaning. In the soft light, Julius smiled in close-up. The gold pattern of his mask only emphasized the sparkle in his gaze, and the thought inside sounded like a confession that needed no words. They were called from the second floor, and the audience's attention turned to them. The masks did not hide the fact that these two were the center of today's story. On the balcony, he announced a reward for unique movements and briefly ordered her to come down. Arya was surprised, feeling how the game suddenly became reality. Arya urged him on, but he replied with a sly smile that running away was not his style. A step forward proved more convincing than any excuse. The shoe hit the floor sharply, the sound cutting through the silence. "Why does my heart beat like that when he's around?" flashed through her mind, like a flash of light accompanied by music. In a whirlwind of dance and sakura petals, he carefully picked her up. Their eyes met, and time stopped for a moment to memorize this image. He lifted her into his arms, to the astonished gaze of his guests. "Do you always appear so quickly in my life?" she whispered, and his smile answered before words. "Just to show off," Arya whispered with a hint of irritation, but the warmth of his closeness betrayed her. He pulled her closer and quietly assured her that he was doing this only for her. Their kiss under the masks became a word where words were superfluous. Flowers and candles whispered around them, preserving their secret in the gold of the walls. In the bright hall, He opened his arms wide and greeted everyone, wishing them good morning as sincerely as if the night had truly ended in victory. A gloved fist shattered the stones, and space exploded with an echo of power. "Power is responsibility," sounded nearby, and he nodded. Protecting her and their world was not a figure of speech. Behind him, the window glass cracked and shattered. He smiled with his eyes closed, as if welcoming a sign of fate, and turned to the light on the shards. Arya looked at the trays of coal in surprise. Julius smiled good-naturedly, and the third one, the silver-haired one, looked between them in bewilderment, trying to put the picture together. The red-haired knight greeted the morning cheerfully. The commander was already preparing gravel for the garden path. The order of the day was as simple as loyalty to one's duty. Arya calmly clutched the wad of paper in her hands, remembering yesterday. Julius held the basket next to her, and her slight smile crumpled along with the paper, turning anxiety into resolution. She crushed something on the table with a smile, and in the background, the scene with the kiss was crossed out with a red cross. As a sign, from now on, the boundaries are clear. He waved off her apology with a gentle sneer, and Arya raised an eyebrow. The short, sharp reply acted as a shield where it would otherwise have hurt, and the conversation found the right tone. Julius, throwing petals and smiling, said that he would soon distract Arya from her heavy thoughts. The servant with the basket froze in surprise, as if seeing this as a trick and concern at the same time. The elegant, sovereign, and heartburn logo featured a sword and ornate designs that emphasized the romantic tone, as if promising a gentle but decisive ending to the chapter. In Chibi, the blue-haired girl celebrated her victory in platinum style. The pink one with the bow was surprised, and the silver-haired one shrugged, accepting the defeat with quiet self-irony. The two held hands in the soft light. "Wait!" she exclaimed, reaching for the rose bracelet, and his step obediently stopped mid-sentence. The blue-haired girl with the teddy bear smiled kindly and promised to change him into something more appropriate for going to the store. Concern sounded more cheerful than any remark. Arya, frightened, reminded them that she was on duty, but the girl in the blue dress joyfully pulled her by the hand through the blooming garden. Duty and childhood went hand in hand. The silver-haired youth looked at the departing carriage and the people outside the window. "Farewell," he exhaled, and the thought of why the heart clings to the past became more honest than words. The blue-haired young man politely asked the fair-haired man's name, acknowledging the respect in his tone, the key to a dialogue without unnecessary titles. In the sunlit hall, Julius informed Arya that she was guarding the youngest today. He spoke simply, trusting her choice more than any regulations. His uniform suddenly flew into the air. How is that possible? He wondered, and Arya appeared in the doorway with a playful smile. Sometimes even clothes want to tell a story. Under the clear sky, Julius adjusted his hat and decided to follow them. "They're having fun, so I'm going," he admitted, and stepped towards where the adventure began. "Huh? What? Where to?" he shouted as the cloaked figure quickly left the mansion, the cloth in his hands the only clue to their pursuit. On the balcony, two silver-haired men were calling for help in panic, while below, a man in a hat smiled calmly, like someone who knew the outcome before anyone else. Outside the restaurant, a carriage gleamed in the morning light. The city breathes history, Arya thought, and Julius smiled. Ready for our little adventure? A seasonal dessert was served on an elegant table. Platinum, the pink girl flushed with delight, and the clink of teaspoons became the music of the stage. At the cafe, the blue-haired girl cheerfully whispered that she and her sister were incognito. The pink-haired girl looked at them in surprise. The mystery made the morning even sweeter. Arya noticed the stranger in the shadows and thought it was time to get out of sight. Anxiety stood softly next to caution. The girl in the lace dress and hat laughed, "Cute!" And for a moment, the fairy tale became more convincing than reality. The pink-haired girl in the hat and gloves beamed with hearts as she looked at the aproned boy behind the tray. Their silent scene said more than a long dialogue. In the bright hall, the maid joyfully asked for forgiveness, and the girl in the hat called her her personal knight. Simple kindness revealed true status. Arya, wearing a hat with flowers, sat in the hall and looked ahead in surprise. In the distance, a man in a hat and glasses watched her attentively and calmly. Arya von Winterhat, elegantly dressed, leaned forward as if about to make a point, a rose in her hand and the precision of a vow in her voice. Platinum. Pink hair, a hat with flowers, and a quiet smile raised to the light. "Sometimes it seems like the whole world answers us more quietly than we'd like," she whispered. In a bright room, a blue dress with a toy stands opposite a white outfit, and a conversation about fidelity to vows. which holds people closer than rituals. The blue-eyed woman said calmly, "He doesn't need protection." The boy, listening, smiled. Recognition of strength cancels guardianship. Julius stood with his back to the shining pattern. Silhouettes surrounded him, and Arya said with a gentle smile that loyalty to the oath is unbreakable. The girl in the hat with a bow glanced nervously into the shade of the flowering trees. Her heart sped up because he appeared. Not too late and not too early, just in time. The man with the monocle calmly sipped tea and suggested that the blue-haired girl surrender. Her surprise turned into a question. "Who are you, and why did you come today?" In the bright hall, a girl in a flowered hat bowed slightly and agreed to the decision. The sun's glint on her dress was the beginning of a feeling difficult to name, but easy to recognize. At the table, Julius quietly said that power alone wasn't enough to get you elected. His smile confirmed experience. The choice belongs to those you lead. A white glove held a teddy bear in a blue dress. "I'll step back," it said softly, making room for hope and tenderness. Julius watched, smiling, as Arya clutched the bear and firmly said that this was not a surrender. The pause had become a plan, not a defeat. On an ancient street, there was a carriage. In the window, a pensive girl. He handed her the packages, and the evening sun added a golden touch to the scene, in which tenderness dominated. The girl at the window hugged the teddy bear tighter and exhaled. The evening light held her silence like a secret that needed no witnesses. In the morning, Arya groaned tiredly, and Julius watched with a playful smile. The day had only just begun, which meant they had enough strength ahead for a new step. They walked down the street side by side, and he asked with a playful smile if she had overheard their conversation. She asked warily, and he only chuckled. Conversations on the street are rarely secret. The most important words are sometimes spoken in the wind. The girl in the flowered hat stopped, looking away. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Her voice sounded soft but confident, like a choice made within. Julius, wearing a hat and gloves, raised a finger and began the conversation with a slight smile, his gaze suggesting that in the world of shadows, clarity was more important than volume. A black glove gently touched the ring finger of the hand with the rose bracelet. The gesture said more than a confession, a careful, "I'm here." Amid the sun's glare, Arya looked down and said nothing, her thoughts racing until memory and hope formed a quiet, "yes." At the masked ball, their steps merged with a waltz. She heard her own inner voice and met his gaze. The secret became tender. In an elegant dress, holding someone's hand, she whispered, "And I lost." And in this confession, there was not defeat, but the fairness of the game. A man in a hat under a golden glow warned, "Don't take off this ring for the rest of your life." And a hand in a red glove touched the metal as if making a vow. On the title page of Chapter 17, an ornament and a sword highlighted the title. The story was about to say what the scenes had long whispered. Arya looked at her gloved right hand and wondered why her heart was beating so strangely. Memories of meeting Julius filled the day with light. The magic glowed softly on her palm, without a single scratch. The question why became not a doubt, but an invitation to understand herself. The young man with the sword yawned and briefly said goodbye. There was more peace in that simple good than in long toasts. "Good morning," Arya said cheerfully to the master and stood at attention. Today, she intended to give it her all. She asked the man urgently about his condition, breaking the comfortable silence. Sometimes concern sounds more demanding than an order. "The ring glows when I hit it," he marveled. She smiled. "With a normal one, I would have broken my hand by now." And the tension became a joke. His hand placed the ring on her finger, the soft light and sparkling love turning the gesture into a promise. At the neon sign, he flinched as her glove grabbed his hand. "Don't be afraid, I'm here to help," she said, and the panic retreated a step. Arya stared at Julius in surprise. He stammered as he asked where she got it, and was startled by his own lack of preparedness to answer. With a slight grin and a drop of sweat, he admitted, "Better not to touch." Sometimes wisdom begins with a held hand. Arya stood against the backdrop of metal fences, staring ahead in amazement. Her inner voice asked why her heart was so loud, and the evening gave her time to hear it. Against the sunset backdrop of the castle, the silhouettes of lovers tenderly held hands, and at the bottom of the ring, a secret engraving shimmered. When two kingdoms were at war, one warrior crafted this ring for his beloved, so that their vow would outlast the war. A young man with dark, tousled hair and green eyes raised a finger on the roof, looking up at the stars, and thought that sometimes a single promise illuminates the way better than any light. In the sunlit courtyard, a man asked Arya if she had heard the legends and stories at fencing school. She listened with amazement, as if hearing for the first time the story in which she was destined to play a leading role. Arya smiled tenderly and admitted that she had never attended fencing school. Her blade was trained by the road, choice, and heart. The man with dark brown hair and a light stubble smiled ominously and tensely in the evening silence, and his shadow became longer than the words. Arya, without looking away, said that he was her first master, and this simple phrase sounded like acceptance and a challenge at the same time. The young man looked into the distance and quietly said that the simplest words can be the most difficult, and the shore before him agreed with this truth. In the morning light outside the palace, Arya suddenly closed her eyes and clutched her head, embarrassed by her own thoughts. Sometimes the right feeling speaks louder than arguments. She looked in surprise at the departing man, whose back hid a glowing object in his hand. There were no more answers, but the questions became more honest. At dawn, Arya happily agreed with her mentor, clenching her fists in determination. Today she would prove that she was worthy of his trust. Under the blue sky, a small, irritated boy flared up. "My name is different!" And the wind carried away his resentment as easily as a leaf. Arya cheerfully asked her interlocutor about his opinion, and the easy day responded to her smile with a clear yes. The carriage rolled majestically along the sunny alley among greenery and flowers, confirming that the road can also be a promise. A young man with silver blue hair, wearing a ceremonial uniform, sat on a red throne and gazed anxiously into the sunset. Crowns are always heavier than armor. Inside the carriage, Julius leaned back lazily, and Arya concentrated. "Pull yourself together," he said softly, and she took a deep breath. "Yes, sir." At the foot of the castle, the carriage stopped, and below, the girl thought about her unexpected enrollment in a fencing school. Sometimes fate comes by letter where you least expect it. At dawn, near the castle, Arya looked into the distance and a soft light embraced her. In this radiance, there was more hope than in any speeches. Lying on the couch, Julius admitted he felt no attachment to this place. Arya listened warmly, because sometimes listening is healing. Julius said thoughtfully that he saw no point in befriending those who were not his equal. The surrounding gold ornaments and blue flowers looked too fragile for such cold logic. Arya closed her eyes wearily and quietly asked him to behave decently. There was no reproach in her voice, only a request to protect what had already grown between them. Julius, leaning against the wall, quietly remarked that it was time to behave decently, and there was no moralizing in his voice, but a request to protect the boundaries that held them both together. In the silence of the hall, the man in uniform collapsed, face first into the cracked wall, leaning on his knees. Raising his head, he whispered with pain and determination that he could not stop halfway. On the dawn square, a hand in a red uniform clenched into a fist. This sounded like the awakening of a force that chooses responsibility over rage. Arya quickly blocked the blow with her body and said calmly, "It was self-defense," while Julius anxiously watched to make sure that justice did not turn into revenge. They stood calmly before the guest. "Thank you for your visit," came the unceremonious greeting, but warm enough to promise a continuation of the conversation. "We are not tied to this place," Arya reminded him with surprise, and he, smiling, replied that sometimes the heart chooses to stay. Right here and now. They were walking side by side across the yard when he suddenly burst out, "No, no, no!" And this cry was not about refusal, but about the fear of losing what had barely come together. The man in dress uniform burst into a desperate cry and demanded an explanation. She listened to the end, hearing in his voice not only anger but also confusion. In the training hall, the young man stumbled on his stance and, in a panic, asked about his legs. The steel of the blade pointed out the error, and the instructor's voice pointed out the way to correct it. Against the backdrop of the castle, a dark uniform with a sword shouted at the kneeling youth, "You don't even know the basics." But behind the anger, one could hear the despair of a man who had once fallen too. The blue sky hung between the walls of the academy. "This is the place of honor for the best knights," they shouted from above, adding harshly that he still couldn't see his own mistakes. The young man lowered his head, tasting shame. However, inside a quiet fire blazed, to correct, to rise, to reclaim his name. The dark-haired man dismissively remarked that it was not without reason that he had forbidden him to accept girls, calling him a worthless thing. The world had suddenly narrowed, but had not broken. The boy was yanked by his hair and ordered to stand up immediately, threatened with expulsion. The grip of pain became a measure of how many more reasons he would have not to give in. Arya stepped forward and firmly demanded that the girl be released. A man nearby was clutching the collar of another young man, and her voice cut through the basement gloom like a blade. A white-gloved hand gripped the fair-haired boy's wrist tightly. He closed his eyes, but her grip was supportive, not punishing. Julius froze with his sword. The young soldier trembled on the ground. "Are you sure this is the right path?" he asked heavily. Arya, unblinking. "The right one isn't always the easy one." Arya leaned over to the boy. "Are you hurt?" He nodded, and her soft smile kept him on his feet better than any bandage. In a narrow, sunny alley, they talked with the guy on his knees. The man in the dark uniform smiled. An excellent chance. And Arya nodded. Sometimes fate comes in the most inconvenient place. Footsteps down the gloomy corridor. A calm voice confidently told her, "Even though you didn't graduate from the academy, your talent and perseverance remove all doubts." The silence took this as an affirmation, not a consolation. The dark-haired man sarcastically threw at the platinum-pink woman. "How long did you kneel to end up in the royal squad?" But her silence remained firmer than words, and the evening light made the sharpness of his phrase empty. She looked into the darkness and quietly admitted that she had been afraid of their paths diverging. The silence accepted this fragility and transformed it into courage to speak further. Anger flared in the hall. The officer accused her of betraying knightly ideals, and she listened calmly, only with slight surprise, as if the accusation said more about him. "What?" the man in uniform gasped, his pupils widening as if he were frightened by his own conclusion before seeing the facts. In a narrow alley, Arya raised her blade and cut. Someone who doesn't wield a sword well has no right to judge chivalry or honor. He shouted that no one was worthy of talking about this, condemning her form as blasphemy. But she calmly held the line, where the rule is not a shout, but an action. Arya, with a slight smile and her fingers at her collar, asked them not to touch her. The request sounded harsher than an order, because there was a boundary in it. The hand in the dress uniform jerked back, and the tension cracked. Sometimes respect begins with a half-step. In the darkness of the old castle, Arya and the young soldier looked up at the same time. Someone's hand was thrust into the ceiling, a sign that the threats had a source, and therefore an answer. In the dungeon, where the lantern drew circles on the stone, the two of them watched the smoke rise above the fallen enemy. Julius's sigh sounded like a period and a comma. "Huh?" Arya whispered in confusion, pulling at a strand of her hair, as if it would be easier to grasp the greater meaning in this small detail. Leaning on his arm, Julius gently reminded them of propriety. This restraint kept them from taking a step they would regret. The young man in uniform desperately beat against the wall, insisting it was self-defense. The stone didn't believe it, but the people nearby heard a tremor in his voice. In the bright hall, Arya anxiously asked Julius why he hadn't told her sooner. Honesty hurts when it comes at the wrong time, but it still heals when you manage to respond. In the foreground, Arya firmly said she would report the female knight's assault. In the background, a man in uniform was screaming, and her calm was separated from the noise and the deed. "If that's the case, she's under my protection," Julius said confidently. To go against her was to go against him, not a threat, but a clear responsibility. The frightened, wounded man looked up into the air, where the words, "So expect punishment," appeared. Fear, for the first time, took on the shape of justice. In the sunny courtyard, soldiers climbed the stairs, chatting. The morning made duty seem like work again, not a legend. Julius beamed, holding her hand tightly and thanking her. Arya listened with a soft smile, thinking that gratitude was also a vow, only a warm one. "You're glowing," he remarked. "Because you didn't run away and behaved yourself," she replied mischievously, adding silently, "Easier to believe that way." Julius extended his hand in invitation, and Arya placed her hand in his with a slight smile. The steps into the sunset warmed them closer than any words, and the evening became their music. He listened intently, leaning a little closer as Arya said, "No!" cheerfully but firmly. Her confidence warmed the silence, and his whispered, "Why so sure?" was a plea for her to stay close. In the glow of the flowers, Arya smiled and said, "Ah, so that's how it is." Sometimes one simple understanding changes the balance of power more gently than any decision. He was surprised by her soft singing at sunset and asked if happiness really came so easily. She replied that she left room in her heart for light, even when the day was getting dark, and his gaze grew warmer. The silver-blue youth looked up in confusion, as if the questions around him had become living signs. But the step forward proved clearer than any answer. A wooden mug filled with foam greeted the evening loudly, and a shout cut through the tavern. The warmth of the fire and the voices made the joy a little more real. The pink-haired girl gave the victory sign and announced that something very good had happened. And the bare-shouldered man was so genuinely surprised that the joy became shared. The short-haired blonde girl spoke with delight, and Arya listened, smiling. When someone admits their admiration, the world becomes more balanced for a moment. In a cozy cafe, her arms folded across her chest, she quietly said that simple moments are sometimes more important than grand plans. The soft light agreed without argument. The pink-haired girl whispered, laughing, "You always know how to surprise me." And he, embarrassed, admitted that he just wanted to see her smile, and the morning became easier. "Another glass?" she asked at the tavern, beaming. The bartender nodded, and the evening slowly turned warm amber. A hooded youth with silver-blue hair looked out the window, illuminated by the sunset. "How beautiful this evening is, as if created for miracles." And the glass became a mirror of hope. On the title page of Chapter 19 of Kunshu-sama ni Muneyake, the pattern shimmered from blue to pink as the story prepared to gently shift its tone from mystery to confession. The doorbell rang, and the hospitable host greeted those who entered with a "Welcome!" The threshold became the boundary between fatigue and rest. Arya spun the wooden horse on the table and smiled at her thoughts. Next to her, the man in the uniform and cloak remained silent, because sometimes silence is the best line. The palm fell sharply on the table, and the quiet, "Girl, you know how much you mean to me," sounded like a confession chosen from all possible ones. She turned to the figure in the dark uniform and, smiling, asked if he always appeared so suddenly. He smiled mysteriously, leaving the air between them for an answer. Arya stood frozen in shock against the backdrop of lightning. Footsteps behind her suggested the test was closer than it seemed, and the garden held her breath. A young man in a black cloak with silvery blue hair timidly asked to join them in a warm room with flowers. Awkwardness and sincerity quickly found a common language. At the tavern, Arya was met in a panic by Julius, who calmly ordered identical dishes for them. "Why are you here?" she asked, and the calm of his answer made the evening safe. Arya slammed the table and exclaimed that this place was her last refuge. And Julius, leaning back, laughed softly, as if he was offering her a new one. He noted with a slight weariness that she could at least once invite him for a drink while sitting next to her, and the mug suddenly seemed like an occasion, not a formality. "You owe me for today," he reminded her with playful confidence. And she, burying her forehead in the table, sighed and thought that sometimes debt was just an opportunity to be alone together. A belated, "Sorry for the wait," rang out between the barrels, and the evening moved on, as if even simple words had their own time magic. A platinum pink crown peeked out from the foam barrel. A ringing, "Thank you!" cracked the seriousness of the scene and returned the lightness. Arya smiled as she watched Julius sit at the table with her mug. His playful response had quietly become a compliment that warmed her heart more than fire. "Oh, really?" she snapped, and he, leaning on his arm, listened to her as if there was a small promise hidden in every word. "Let's compete. Who has the most?" Arya suggested slyly, raising her foamy glass. The bet, as always, wasn't in the drink. Julius, resting his cheek on his fist, smiled through the warm light and took his time, like someone who understood the value of a slow evening. They clinked glasses loudly and cheerfully, and at that moment, the tavern became a small world where every toast has an address. At the counter, they spoke quietly to the bartender. Their eyes occasionally met, leaving something clear but unspoken between the words. The owner listened to them animatedly. Customers gathered around, and Julius, with a half-joking seriousness, told the story as if he were writing it anew. Arya raised the pitcher higher. Julius held her by the elbow. The bartender smiled, and the man dozing at the counter nodded peacefully to his dreams. The evening was going as it should. Tired, Arya buried her face in the table and whispered that she would have given a lot for a plate of cakes right now, and put down the glass so abruptly, as if putting a period. The bartender, wiping his mug, watched them rise. "We'll be back soon," sounded quiet and convincing, like a password to the door. The door in the far corridor with the sign "Toilette" slammed, and the short sigh behind it made the moment dramatic without any scene. An invisible click of tension passed through the room. Arya watched the sunset from the window, and Julius's hand on her shoulder spoke louder than words. The young man lay in the courtyard at night, breathing heavily, looking at the stars. Sometimes it is harder to admit weakness than strength. "Ha! Damn!" he breathed out and clenched his fists, breaking free from the internal struggle. The sky above accepted this honest heartbeat. The blue eyes shuddered from the sudden wave. Ooh. And the world, as if looking back, reminded. All living things have the right to weakness in order to become stronger tomorrow. In the darkness of the room, he breathed heavily, leaning his palm against the wall, and the moonlight cut the silence into thin stripes. The proximity of the abyss was a strange reminder of how close salvation could be. The thought flashed briefly. It was close, and an almost inaudible, almost succeeded, touched the air. She stood nearby and caught the rhythm of his voice with her heart. In the warm tavern, the stranger with 2 bottles nodded. They had behaved with dignity. Julius gently touched Arya's shoulder, her face resting on the table, and the evening became gentle again. The glass clinked against the wood. "It's rare to see such a confrontation," he said evenly, the pause taking the words as a sign of respect, not noise. At the wooden table, the young man raised his hand over his glass and sighed, as if searching for answers deep within. The light fell on his fingers like a question. The bald worker chuckled, saying that he enjoyed their frequent competitions. Without courage, nothing happens. She smiled. That's how a team is born. He took a sip from the green glass, drops of it trickling down his chin. The casual gesture held more honesty than his rehearsed speeches. "I can't lose," Arya whispered, her forehead resting on the table. A hand quietly placed a cup next to her. Not a consolation, but a support. He took a deep breath. "I've been wanting to tell you something important for a long time." His voice trembled, and the silence in the room carefully allowed him to finish. The platinum-pink hair slept peacefully on the table among the papers and wooden walls. The evening held it so carefully, as if afraid to awaken hope. In the warmly lit library, Julius looked away, containing his emotions. The open book before him reminded him, the main thing is not written. "Wake up," he called softly, and her eyelashes fluttered. There was a fine line of trust between the word and awakening. The ring rested on her ring finger in the candlelight. Her fingers trembled, and the thought of the moment became stronger than a vow. The barrel wheel fell with a dull thud to the floor, cutting through the silence. A sign that the plot had turned, even if no one stood up. He was tugged sharply by the shirt and stepped back. "Why are you running away?" they asked quietly. "I don't want to hurt you," was the answer, which was itself pain. They came face to face, and the silence was filled with awe. The words lingered on the lips, because the look said more. Arya clutched the fabric tightly, her eyes filled with determination and a hint of fear. The flowers around her shining as if they were supporting her steps. Julius, meeting her gaze in surprise, held her hand to his chest. Why did her touch? The thought broke off, giving way to feeling. The pink-haired girl became embarrassed and looked away, trying to unravel what was said. The thread of meaning remained in her fingers. Arya, confused, grabbed Julius by the front of his uniform. He smiled with his usual playful confidence. "And what do you want?" Knowing that the answer was already shining in her eyes, Julius supported her shoulders as her breath hitched and her hands shook, becoming a quiet support so she could stand up straight again and speak without rushing. He carefully held Arya back, but she pulled away abruptly, and a loud laugh from the side cut the pause. "Why are you pulling away?" flashed through his mind, and she breathed out, haltingly. "Hey, it's okay." The inscription, Sovereign and Heartburn, shimmered across the delicate sword design. Chapter 20 promised romance, nobility, and choices made together. He carried Arya in his arms through the night street. She called out to him cheerfully, and the pink-haired girl, laughing, hugged him from behind. The nightlight brought the three of them a little closer than protocol intended. She playfully shouted in his ear, and he winced and asked her not to yell. His tone remained warm, because irritation never overshadowed tenderness. They walked under the evening lights, hugging, and Arya quietly admitted that she had previously been angry at his sword. Now she saw it not as a threat, but as a promise to be there. She hugged him, smiling, and their faces were very close. "You know," Arya said, and his gaze finished the rest of the sentence. They argued about cheerful, exchanging light reproaches in the pastel light of dawn. In such squabbles, habituation sounds louder than confessions. At the entrance ceremony to the fencing school, their first glances already held a quiet promise of change, as if the plot had chosen them before they had chosen each other. The pink-haired girl sat on his back in the academy's hallway. He whispered about the swordswoman who had been rejected, and his steps became more stubborn. The wanted poster showed a pink-haired girl and a defeated examiner. In the library, Arya turned the page and realized how foolish power can be without conscience. He carried Arya on his back under the stars, and said that the stars seemed to whisper a secret to them. She smiled and decided not to frighten this secret. Arya closed her eyes, her lips trembling slightly, and she whispered that her heart belonged only to him. He smiled, feeling the answer become warmth, not a formula. She patted him cheerfully on the back. He looked away irritably, but he couldn't keep the seriousness in his eyes. The corners of his lips still betrayed him. He leaned back with a laugh, and she leaned against his back. The sunset painted the garden pink, and it became easier for both of them to call it happiness. On a starry night, her pink hair fluttered, and she quietly said, "But," leaving an ellipsis which includes everything difficult and necessary. She hugged him with her eyes closed and whispered, "If everything was like this, I'm glad." He answered just as quietly, and the world stopped rushing for a moment. Their evening by the fireplace was interrupted by a sudden fall and a fright. The warmth of the fire did not go out, but simply became a reason to hold on to each other tighter. "What are you doing?" Arya asked, surprised, watching him climb onto the bed, breathless. "I can't hide my feelings anymore," he said, the flickering fire giving his words courage. Arya realized with horror that she had lost in the drinking game, and Julius reassured her. Defeats only count where they are acknowledged, and here she hadn't run out of points yet. She hugged him around the waist and offered him some water, feeling her strength fading, but he gently declined and assured her that he could handle it, asking only for a little silence nearby. He met her calm gaze in the night with alarm. "You are not alone, Julius. I am here," she said quietly, and his sigh became more even than fear. The platinum pink girl suddenly realized that losing the competition would result in punishment. The thought pricked her, but she decided on one thing: not to lose. He whispered the idea of knee punishment into her ear, and the confusion in her eyes mixed with surprise, turning into warmth. Julius knelt down and asked for permission. She nodded with a slight smile, not as a concession, but as a sign of trust. Seeing him slump to the floor, Arya anxiously asked him to stretch his legs and let her put her hands under his head so that she could breathe more easily. In the semi-darkness, she quietly agreed, containing her excitement. "Okay, for his sake," Arya thought, looking at his silhouette by the window. In the silence of the room with the fireplace, Julius settled into her lap, and she sat on the edge of the bed, holding the moment with both hands. He fell asleep peacefully on a pillow with an oval brooch and a red bow, the moonlight making his face calm as a promise. "Are you asleep yet?" Arya smiled in the soft nightlight, where even the stars seemed to listen to her whisper. She gently touched his shoulder. "Are you sure you're asleep?" He quietly answered, "Yes," barely opening his eyes. She sat down next to him and began to simply be near him. In his sleep, his fingers touched his ear, and blue roses shimmered. His breathing was even, like music heard only by two. Her hand reached out to his silver blue hair, the touch so light, as if afraid to wake the peace. Arya looked away, lost in wondering why her heart was beating so strangely. Premonition had become the new name for love. He lay among the glowing blue flowers, his eyes closed and smiling faintly, as if awakening was within, not without. Arya supported his head on her lap, their shadows blending against the light background. In this moment, we are silence, she thought. Sparks flashed across the black sky, and her lips smiled. Have you ever thought that silence is louder than confessions? Sounded almost inaudible. A young man in dark stood at the castle walls with a confident smile and introduced himself as an elite assassin. The dawn emphasized the steel in his voice. He broke into a run across the room, and the girl's photograph slipped from his fingers, slowly spinning toward the floor like a belated answer. A photograph of Arya von Winterhat lay on the stones of the courtyard, with a winter boot print next to it, a sign that the meeting had already begun without words. The blue-eyed, blonde-braided girl in the beret held her breath as she read the letter with the name on it. The floral pattern and opulence of the room only heightened the feeling that this message was a game-changer. Sovereign and heartburn shimmered on the sword ornament. On the palace balcony, Arya watched the sunset, ready for the choice she couldn't escape. In the throne room, the white-haired, mustachioed king, wearing a crown, stood frozen in amazement. His gaze darted to the doors, as if the answer had already arrived and was just waiting to be called. Among the dresses in the spacious hall stood a man and a child in royal robes. "Too many decorations," he remarked. The child nodded in confusion, not knowing what to be happy about. Julius suggested that they ask Arya's mother's opinion. The little man agreed, making no secret of the fact that he had never met her and was therefore not prepared to pretend to make a decision. Green eyes beneath black hair looked forward, and the phrase, "Damn prince," flared up like a spark of internal conflict that was time to be named. The king lashed out at the man in uniform, while behind him, the small, black-haired man shrugged his shoulders in irritation. The luxurious room with its dresses only emphasized the extra glitter over the meaning. Under the blanket, the green-eyed youth listened to the rustling sounds in surprise. "What is that?" he thought, feeling his fear give way to curiosity. In the light, the gloved palm held a photograph of Arya von Winterhut. His gaze lingered on her smile, as if trying to discern what made her calm. Behind the curtains, a girl with blue eyes was laughing with a green-eyed guy. "Look, an old photo. Can you guess who?" "Who something from the past that has not yet gone away." In the winter garden, a blue-eyed woman in a warm outfit looked at a man who exclaimed, "Why is the princess here?" And the snow became even quieter than before the question. The dark-haired man in gloves showed his business card. Jack, Commandant de Galdemont. The news sparkled in his voice like a key that had been asked for too long. In the warm tent, she listened attentively to the embarrassed black-haired man with the note. "Tell me honestly." Sounded kinder than any consolation. She smiled softly at the flower frame. "Well, if that's the case." And her tone became an invitation to continue without breaking the silence. In the square, the performers were bringing out fire and animals, and Julia said, "Then let's go!" Arya smiled, feeling the street magic thaw her heart. He leaned thoughtfully on his arm, a crowned doll clapping her hands next to him. "Shall we watch together?" he asked, and her nod made the theater seem more real. In the foreground, a blue-eyed woman and a black-haired man watched anxiously as two figures in the garden approached. "What you hear in a whisper is sometimes louder than orders," sounded inside. The girl tugged at his coat, and he panicked and denied. "I'm not ready." "You can't back down anymore," she said, offering her hand instead of an argument. Green eyes widened. "Exactly," he realized, putting together the disparate signs into one line of action. In his brown cloak, he abruptly shielded the girl in the blue dress. His determination to become a shield proved the best proof of his truth. The three men at the table turned to look at the suddenly appearing black-haired man. He gasped, "I can't hide it anymore." And silence gathered between them. The masked youth darted to intercept the exploding bomb. The second stretched out, his arm extended in a desperate arc, and fear gave way to determination. The silver-blue youth fearfully embraced the elderly king, while the white-haired one, looking into the distance, suppressed his alarm. The sunny hall became thinner than the glass between generations. In the crowd on the square, a dark cloak threw a bomb towards the table of two friends. The dawn light wavered, cups rattled, and the alien silence turned into a scream. He sat by the window, where the sunset glided across his cheek. Behind him, the blue-haired man and the cloaked king exchanged glances of unexpected surprise, as if their thoughts had spoken aloud. In the arena, a baby elephant created a fountain. A rainbow spread through the air. Two men and the king looked on in amazement, and a child's game brought them out of their political posture. The black-haired man in the cloak was crying with joy in the foreground, and the girl in a light winter outfit was praising him. "Jack, you're the best!" Behind, the two silently acknowledged this. Among the morning flowers, Julius leaned on his arm. "Why is my heart restless when she's near?" The memory of her smile warmed him like the first ray of light. Silverblue sighed as he looked at the dripping man in blue, the humor of the moment breaking the tension. In the square, the blue cloak unfurled. "We need to find the criminals," he said, and left. Two others, one with an umbrella, decided to follow him without further ado. Golden sparks against a light background froze in anticipation. At the fountain, her quiet smile became a gentle admission to the miracle. Julius peered cautiously into the room where Arya stood by the fireplace, and the short, "Oh," sounded warmer than the long speech. With a playful smile, he asked her what she was doing there as he stepped into the warm light, the question sounding more like an invitation to share than a report. At the table, he asked why she hadn't accompanied him today. The pause between their sentences honestly revealed his concern. Arya apologized, clutching the papers. She had gotten carried away with red tape. The light in the room made her fatigue visible, but not heavy. Julius stood in the hall with a slight smile, looking at his interlocutor, whose sword was in the foreground. "You are always confident, Arya. And what is behind the smile?" The answer flickered in her thoughts. With her back to the hall, in the soft light, she straightened her uniform and sighed. Today, the thought gathered itself, like a hilt to a blade. Hearing the name and a warm touch on her shoulder, Arya turned around. "What happened?" "I wanted to make sure you were okay. and the smile between the lines became quieter but closer. In the bright office, he unexpectedly hugged her. "Why is my heart beating like this?" flashed through Julius's mind as she learned not to back down from reciprocity. In the sunbeam, Arya, shyly clutching the brooch, felt someone's hand on her shoulder. The confession was still unspoken, but it had already happened. Julius stood by the window in the soft evening light, and suddenly, finding himself in a rare state of excitement, realized, answers only come when someone has something to ask. "What?" he breathed out, looking at Arya. She timidly raised her eyes. "I want to be near you." And silence became their common response. Noticing her confusion, he quietly asked what was wrong with her face. She looked away, simply lost in thought, and he suggested they take a walk to let her thoughts flow more smoothly. Arya smiled and playfully asked if there was anything left on her face. The lightness of the question softened the tension, like a glare of sunlight on glass. In his dress uniform, he took a step across the room, feeling his heart speed up. Expectation is also a movement, only inward. She pressed herself against him, and he froze at the window, not immediately finding the words. "I've been waiting for a long time," she whispered, and his hand carefully found her fingers. When his palm rose to her face, Arya flinched. "Tell me the truth," he demanded quietly, and time obediently stopped between their gazes. A bead of sweat rolled down her cheek in the warm light. "Why does my heart beat so fast next to him?" she thought, and the memory of their chance encounter responded with warmth. From above, his gaze caught her running across the hall, like an inevitability to which she herself had chosen the path. Her steps sounded more confident than fanfares. At the window, looking out onto the golden courtyard, he whispered, "Every sunset reminds me of you, of what remains between us." And the wind agreed with the movement of the curtains. The delicate ornamentation and sword on the emblem cemented the chapter's title. The aria at the window and the sunset. The introduction to an answer that needs no witnesses.